Abigail Parker slammed her last silver dollar onto the auctioneer's table so hard the whole yard went quiet. Behind the fence, the black stallion screamed and threw himself against the rails, whites of his eyes blazing, hooves cracking wood like gunshots. 3 grown men stumbled backward. A woman in the crowd grabbed her husband's arm, and Abigail did not flinch. $1, she said. Her voice did not shake. That's my bid. The laughter started somewhere near the back. Then it spread, slow and ugly, until the whole auction yard was laughing at the widow with the empty purse and the broken ranch and the wild, unkillable horse that nobody in Red Creek, Wyoming wanted to touch. She let them laugh. She had stopped caring about laughter the day they lowered her husband into the frozen ground. If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. And please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop your city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and I read every single one. Now let's go back to Red Creek, Wyoming, 1884, and find out what one woman, $1, and one impossible horse did to an entire town that had already decided she was finished. The auction yard at Red Creek smelled like sawdust and cattle, and the particular brand of contempt that small towns reserve for people who have fallen and not yet hit the ground. It was the 3rd Tuesday of October, 1884, and the sky over Wyoming was the color of an old bruise, purple and yellow at the edges, dark gray pressing down from the center, like a hand trying to smother something that refused to go out. The mountains to the west had already taken their first dusting of snow. Winter was not coming. Winter was already there, standing at the door, waiting to be let in. Abigail Parker had driven her wagon into town alone. That was the first thing people noticed. A woman alone on a wagon bench, no ranch hand riding beside her, no neighbor accompanying her out of courtesy or pity. Just Abigail, 27 years old, with her dark hair pulled back under a hat that had belonged to her mother, and her late husband Daniel's old wool coat across her shoulders because it was the warmest thing she owned. And warmth mattered more than grief in October. She tied the horse to the post at the edge of the yard and walked in through the gate without looking at anyone. People looked at her. Abigail Parker had been the subject of a great deal of looking in Red Creek since the spring. Since Daniel died. Since the fever took the cattle. Since the bank sent its letters and the neighbors started having conversations that stopped the moment she walked into the general store. She was used to being looked at. She was not used to being seen. Those were 2 entirely different things, and in her experience, the people of Red Creek were very talented at one and completely incapable of the other. The auction yard was full. It was a significant sale. Winter was coming, and ranchers needed to make decisions about their stock. Buy what they needed. Cut what they couldn't carry through the cold months. There were horses, mules, a pair of oxen at the far end that 2 brothers from the north side of the valley were arguing over in loud voices. There were men she recognized, and men she didn't. There were a few women, wives mostly, standing near their husbands with their arms folded against the cold. Nobody came to stand near Abigail. She found a place along the fence at the midpoint of the yard and stood there with her arms loose at her sides and her eyes moving through the pens, taking inventory the way Daniel had taught her, looking at each animal with the same careful attention. Legs, weight, eyes, the way they held themselves when they were not being watched. It was when she was doing this, working her way slowly along the pens, that she saw the stallion. How was in the last pen, the one farthest from the entrance, set a little apart from the other animals as though even the livestock wanted distance from him. The fence around his pen was heavier than the others. Extra rails, extra posts driven deep into the hardpan, the whole structure reinforced with iron brackets that caught the thin October light. He was black, not dark brown, not dark bay. Black in the way that certain things are black, completely and without apology. Black from his nose to the tip of his tail with no marking, no star on his forehead, no white sock on any leg. He was enormous, easily 17 hands, built heavy through the chest and hindquarters, with a neck that arched like something a sculptor would have made if sculptors worked in living muscle. His mane had not been combed in a long time and it tangled across his neck in ropes. Howe was standing in the center of his pen, with his head up and his nostrils flared and his eyes moving constantly. tracking every person who came within 20 feet of the fence, calculating, assessing, deciding. Every few minutes, something in the crowd would shift. A man stepping forward, a sound from another pen, a child running. And the stallion would explode without warning, launching himself at the fence with a scream that made people jump back and children cry. The fence held, so far. Abigail stood at the fence and looked at him. She watched him for a long time. She watched the way he moved in those explosive bursts. Not random, not mindless, the way a truly crazy animal moves, but pointed. He moved toward specific things. He screamed at specific people. When the yard was quiet and no one was pressing close to his pen, he stood still, and she could see his sides heaving with something that looked, from where she stood, much less like rage and much more like fear. "You don't want to get any closer to that fence, ma'am." The voice came from her left. She turned and found a man she didn't know. Older, with a weather-scored face and a rancher's hands, and the kind of eyes that had watched a great deal of the world go past without being particularly impressed by any of it. "Why not?" Abigail said. "Because that horse put a man in the ground last spring," the man said. Not unkindly, just fact. Well, not in the ground, but close enough that the doc wasn't sure for a while which way it'd go. Horse belonged to Gerald Marsh over in Sweetwater County. Marsh bought him as a 2-year-old off a stock trader and tried to break him. Took 3 men and 6 months, and the horse broke all 3 of them before they broke anything in him. He paused. Then it went through 2 other owners. Same story both times. Nobody can ride him, nobody can work him, can barely get near enough to feed him without losing a hand. Marsh finally decided to cut his losses and sell him off. "What's his name?" Abigail said. The man blinked. "Whose name?" "The horse's name." "The horse?" He seemed to find this an unusual question. "I believe they call him Thundervale, on account of the noise he makes." Abigail turned back to the pen. Thundervale had stopped his restless circling and was standing again, facing the fence, facing her, his ears moving back and forward and back again in quick small rotations, like he was trying to tune in a sound that kept slipping out of range. "Thank you," she said to the man behind her. He touched his hat and moved away, probably glad to be clear of her and whatever she was thinking. Abigail stayed at the fence. She did not try to reach through the rails. She did not make any sudden movement. She just stood there and let him look at her, and she looked back at him, and she thought about what she had heard. 3 owners. Men who knew horses. Men with resources and hands to help them and time to spend. And not one of them had found a way through. She was still standing at the fence when the auction started at the north end of the yard, and the auctioneer's voice began rising and falling over the crowd, working through the oxen and the mules first, moving toward the horses. She listened with half her attention and kept the other half on the stallion, watching him respond to the sounds. The auctioneer's chant, the crowd's noise, the occasional sharp crack of a hoof against wood somewhere in the pens. He didn't like sudden sounds. She noticed that he was better, slightly, when the noise was steady and rhythmic, like the auctioneer's voice, which rose and fell in a pattern. It was the unpredictable things that sent him into his explosive panic. The random shout from across the yard. The child who screamed in play. The man who laughed too hard at something and slapped his knee. She was still thinking about this when the auctioneer arrived at the pen and things got complicated. "Now, gentlemen and ladies," the auctioneer began, with the particular sort of theatrical pause that men in his profession used to signal that something unusual was coming. "This next animal is a special case. Thundervale, 4 years old, 17 hands, thoroughbred bloodline on the dam side. I'm going to be honest with you, because this is Red Creek, and we do business honest in Red Creek." Another pause. "This horse has a history. We know it, the previous owners know it, and I expect by now most of you know it too. He has not been successfully ridden. He has not been successfully worked. 3 experienced horsemen have tried and failed. He is being offered for whatever the market will bear, with the understanding that whoever takes him as he is." The crowd had pushed in around the pen. Abigail found herself pressed between a large man in a sheepskin coat and a woman who smelled of lavender soap and kept making small disapproving sounds through her nose. "What's the opening bid?" someone called from the back. "We'll start at $10, the auctioneer said. Silence. Not the expectant silence of a crowd about to bid. The flat, dead silence of a crowd that has collectively decided something is not worth the breath it would take to make a number. "5, someone said, from somewhere in the middle. The tone of voice that said, this was a joke bid, not a real one, said with the expectation of laughter, and the laughter came. "5 I have," the auctioneer said, and his voice had changed slightly, taken on the quality of a man who knows this is going to be harder than he expected. "Do I have 6? No one spoke. $6, gentlemen, for a 4-year-old thoroughbred cross. "Thoroughbred cross that'll put you in a box," a man said, and more laughter followed. $5 once, the auctioneer said, sounding tired. $5 twice. $1. Abigail said it clearly, without raising her voice, in the same tone she used to say anything that mattered to her. She did not push to the front of the crowd. She did not make a show of it. She simply said the number. The man in the sheepskin coat looked down at her. The woman who smelled of lavender turned. The auctioneer found her in the crowd and stared at her for a moment. "Ma'am, the current bid is $5. "I understand that," Abigail said. "But nobody else is bidding, and I'm offering $1. More silence. Then a voice from the back, she couldn't see whose, said, "Is that the Parker widow?" The murmur that followed this question moved through the crowd like water finding the shape of its container, spreading and settling and changing the temperature of the whole yard in about 10 seconds. She heard her own name more than once. She heard Daniel's name. She heard the word widow, which always managed to sound, in certain mouths, like a verdict. The $5 bidder, she still couldn't see him, said loudly, "I withdraw my bid." More laughter. Charles Bennett's laugh was the one she recognized. She knew it because she had grown up hearing it at the edges of her father's conversations, at church socials and town meetings. Always the loudest laugh in any room. Always the one that sounded most like it was laughing at something rather than with it. Charles Bennett was 48 years old, owned the largest cattle operation in the county, had served 2 terms on the town council, and had made 3 separate offers on her land since Daniel died. Each one lower than the last. Each one delivered with the same smile that was not really a smile, the expression of a man who knows the outcome already and is merely performing patience. Howe was standing near the front of the crowd, and he was looking at her with that expression now. "Mrs. Parker," he said, and the crowd settled into a listening quiet. Bennett had the gift of making people want to hear what he was going to say next, which Abigail had always thought was one of the most dangerous gifts a dishonest man could have. "I say this with genuine concern for your welfare. That horse has hurt people. Seriously. He is not a project for a person in your situation." "What is my situation, Mr. Bennett?" Abigail said. The question did not come out sharply. It came out with real curiosity, as if she actually wanted to know the answer, and Bennett blinked, because it was not the response he expected. "You're," he began. "A widow," she said, when he hesitated. "Alone. Ranch in difficulty. Not enough money." She listed these things the way you list facts that belong to someone else, things observed rather than felt. "Those are the things that are true. I know them. But none of them are reasons I can't make a bid at a public auction." $1, someone called from the crowd, in a mocking sing-song. "She's going to save Red Creek with $1. $1 for the widow's horse," someone else added, and the laughter was general now, rolling through the whole yard. The auctioneer looked at her. He was a decent man, she believed. He had the look of a man who was not enjoying this particular moment in his professional life. "Mrs. Parker," he said quietly, leaning slightly toward her. "The previous bid was $5. "And the previous bidder withdrew it," Abigail said. "So the field is open, isn't it?" He looked at the crowd. "Does anyone else wish to bid on Thunder Vale?" The silence this time was complete. Even the laughter stopped. No one wanted the horse. They all knew it. The $5 bid had been a joke, and the man who made it had been happy enough to pull it back when doing so gave him a way to make her look foolish instead. No one was going to bid a real number on an animal they considered worthless and dangerous. and no one was going to hand her a victory by making her work for it. So they said nothing. The auctioneer's gavel came down. $1, sold to Mrs. Parker. What followed was not applause. It was a particular sound that Abigail had not heard before and would not forget. A sort of collective exhale that carried inside it equal parts amusement and pity and contempt, and, underneath all of that, buried under all the other things, something that might have been the very beginning of discomfort. The first whisper of uncertainty from people who expected to feel superior, and were finding, somewhere in the back of their chests, that something about this moment wasn't sitting exactly right. She walked to the auctioneer's table and placed the silver dollar on the wood. She had been carrying it in her coat pocket all morning. It was warm from her hand. "Thank you," she said to the auctioneer, and turned back toward the pen. Behind her, Bennett's voice carried across the yard. "You know what that horse is, Mrs. Parker? That horse is a liability. Everything you touch turns to loss. Now you've bought yourself one more." She stopped walking. She stood still for a moment. Then she turned and looked at him across the crowd. "You know what I believe, Mr. Bennett? I believe you've never once in your life bought anything that you thought might cost you something. I believe you've only ever bought sure things, things that were already safe, already broken, already trained to come when you called." She paused. "You and I have a different understanding of value." She turned back to the pen. Nobody laughed. Not this time. The horse was watching her when she got back to the fence. He had not thrown himself at the rails while the crowd pressed in. She had noticed that, noticed him watching the crowd rather than attacking it, noticed him choosing stillness when the noise rose, noticed the small, careful choices of a creature that was not out of control, but in desperate, exhausting control of itself. "All right," she said to him quietly. "Let's figure out how to get you loaded." Getting Thunder Vale loaded took the better part of 2 hours, and if anyone in Red Creek had walked past the yard that afternoon, they would have seen something that defied easy explanation. The horse that had sent men to the doctor would not let a single one of the auction yard's hands within 30 feet of his pen, but when Abigail stood at the gate alone, with no rope in her hand and no stick and nothing to offer him but a low voice and complete stillness, he did not come to her. She was not foolish enough to expect that on the first day. But he did not charge either. He watched her. He breathed hard through his nose. He moved to the far side of the pen and stayed there, trembling slightly, every muscle in his body coiled and ready, but watching. She talked to him for a long time. She was not sure afterward what she said. Pieces of it came back to her. She talked about the drive-in that morning, about the state of the south fence that needed mending, about how cold the winter was going to be. She could feel it in the way the mountains were already disappearing into cloud. She talked about Daniel, a little, about the particular way he had of reading weather by the color of the evening sky, a skill she had been trying to learn and had not mastered yet. Thunder Vale's breathing slowed. His ears, which had been flat back against his skull since the crowd arrived, began their small forward rotations again. At some point, she stepped back from the gate and left it open. The auction hand, who was watching from 50 feet away, told people later that the black stallion walked out of the pen on his own and stopped next to the widow's wagon and waited there while she attached the lead rope, and that he had never seen anything like it and would not have believed it if he hadn't seen it himself. The drive back to the ranch took an hour and a half. Abigail rode in the wagon, and Thunder Vale walked behind on the lead, sometimes surging forward when the wagon hit a rut or a stone clattered under the wheels, always catching himself, always bringing himself back, maintaining the distance between them with what she could only describe as effort, conscious effort, a decision made over and over. I will not run, I will stay, I will see where this leads. She understood that feeling exactly. Samuel Whitaker was waiting at the gate of her ranch when she arrived. Samuel was 63 years old and had worked horses since before Abigail was born. He had been her father's hired man, then Daniel's, and after Daniel died, he had stayed on at a wage that she could not truly afford, and he had not once mentioned this fact to her face. He was a quiet man with a white beard and the posture of someone who has spent most of his life outdoors and has made a private peace with weather. He looked at the stallion standing behind the wagon. I was quiet for a long time. "That's Thunder Vale," he said finally. "It is," Abigail said. "I heard about that horse 2 years back," Samuel said. "Out of the Sweetwater County sale. Heard Gerald Marsh couldn't do anything with him." "Gerald Marsh couldn't," Abigail said. "We're going to try something different." Samuel looked at the horse for a long time more. "Different how?" "I'm not going to try to break him," Abigail said. Samuel turned and looked at her. "I'm not going to fight him," she said. "I'm going to let him decide." Samuel was quiet for so long that she thought he was going to tell her she was wrong, or foolish, or both. He had that right. He had earned it through decades of knowing horses and understanding the things they could and couldn't do, and the ways humans could and couldn't help them. "That's a long road," he said at last. "I know," she said. "He might never come around." "He might not," she said. "And if he doesn't?" She looked at the stallion. He was standing quiet now, the lead rope hanging loose between them, his head dropping slightly in the particular way horses carry themselves when they are tired. Not broken tired, deeply bone tired, the way a creature feels when it has been fighting for too long without anyone offering it a reason to stop. "Then he'll have had a place to rest," she said. "And that's worth something." Samuel looked at her. Then he looked at the horse. Then he walked to the gate and opened it for her. They put Thunder Vale in the East Corral, the largest of the three, with the fence that Daniel had reinforced the second year of their marriage because he had intended to run more horses, and the stronger fence had seemed like optimism made from wood and iron. She was glad of it now. The fence would hold. The stallion moved into the space and circled it once, fast, nose down, taking the measure of his new territory, and then he moved to the center and stopped and stood with his head up and his eyes moving, cataloging everything. Abigail filled the water trough herself. She left hay at the gate, inside the corral, without going in. She did not push the first day. She had learned that much from Daniel, who had been a patient man with animals and with people. Patient in a way that she had sometimes found frustrating when she was younger, and had since come to understand was its own form of intelligence. That evening, she sat on the top rail of the fence and watched the sky go dark over the mountains and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into night. The horses in the west pasture, the distant complaint of a coyote, the wind picking up from the north with that knife-edge quality that meant snow before the week was out. Thunder Vale stood in the center of the corral. He was not eating yet. She had not expected him to eat. He was doing what she was doing, watching, thinking, deciding. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," she said to him. He turned his head at the sound of her voice. "We've got time," she said. It was not entirely true. The bank's letter was sitting on the kitchen table, the one that had arrived 4 days ago, the one she had not yet opened because she was afraid of what opening it would make real. The note on the ranch was due in 90 days. She had a partial payment ready, built from the sale of the last of the cattle stock, and 2 months of taking in mending and washing from the town's better households. It was not enough for the full amount. It would not be enough by itself. But Charles Bennett's offer was still on the table, too. His last letter had been very clear. $800 for the land, the house, the outbuildings, the water rights. $800 was not what the property was worth, not by a considerable distance. Daniel's father had paid 3 times that amount 20 years earlier, and land values had not fallen since. But it was $800 more than she had. She had not answered the letter. She looked at the stallion in the dark corral. He had lowered his head slightly. She could see the gleam of his eye from where she sat. "We're going to figure it out," she told him. Not entirely for his benefit. Thunder Vale swung his head away and looked at the north fence and the dark mountains beyond it, and she felt, inexplicably, that she understood exactly what he was looking at. 3 days passed. On the first day, Abigail sat on the fence at sunrise and talked. She talked for 2 hours. Thunder Vale stood at the far end of the corral and ate hay from the pile she had left at the gate, eating with his side turned toward her so he could watch her out of the corner of one eye without appearing to look at her directly. She recognized this too. She had done it herself, in the weeks after the funeral, standing at the edges of church socials and looking at people sideways, because looking at them directly required a kind of energy she did not have to spare. On the second day, She brought a bucket of grain and set it in the middle of the corral and left. When she came back an hour later, the bucket was empty and the stallion was in the far corner, watching her with an expression that could have been hostility or hunger or something considerably more complicated than either. On the third day, she went inside the corral for the first time. Samuel watched from the gate, which was how she knew, without asking, that he was worried. Samuel only watched something closely when he believed the thing he was watching was about to go wrong, and he wanted to be ready to act on that information. She stood just inside the gate and did not move toward the horse. Thundervale exploded. He came at the fence on her left side with a scream that she felt in her back teeth, slamming into the rails with his shoulder, rebounding, turning, coming back, making himself as large and terrible as he could in the way that prey animals do when they are trying to make predators decide the cost is too high. He was not trying to hurt her. She understood that, even in the moment when every nerve in her body was insisting that she run. He was trying to make her leave. She did not leave. She stood at the gate with her hands loose at her sides, and she breathed, slowly and steadily, in through the nose and out through the mouth. And she watched him without staring directly into his eyes, because direct eye contact was a challenge, and she was not there to challenge him. He ran 3 circuits of the corral at full speed, and on the second circuit he came close enough to the gate that she felt the air move as he passed, felt the ground shake under the weight of him, smelled the hot grass smell of a horse running hard, and she stood still, and he completed the circuit and came back and ran again, and on the 4th circuit he slowed, and on the 5th he stopped. He was blowing hard. His coat was dark with sweat along the neck and flanks. He stood in the center of the corral and looked at her. She looked back at him. "I know," she said. "I'm still here." His breathing slowed, very gradually, over the next several minutes. She watched his sides, watched the rate of his breath, watched the position of his ears, all the small signals that horses broadcast constantly to anyone who knows how to read them. The continuous broadcast of their inner state, what they fear, and what they want, and what they are deciding. His ears moved forward, not all the way, halfway, asking something rather than asserting something. A question. She stayed at the gate for another hour. He did not come to her, but he stopped moving away. When she climbed back over this gate, Samuel was there, and he did not say anything, but he put a hand briefly on her shoulder, and she understood that this was the most unambiguous expression of approval she was likely to get from him, and she was glad of it. That evening, she opened the bank letter. She sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of her and a cup of tea that went cold before she finished reading, and she read it twice, carefully, the way her mother had taught her to read anything official, slowly, without skipping, without letting her mind run ahead to the conclusion before she had all the facts. The facts were not kind. The note was due in 87 days. The outstanding balance was $412. The partial payment she had ready would cover $230 of that. The remaining $182 did not currently exist in any account she held. She folded the letter and set it beside the salt cellar and looked at the wall. Daniel's rifle hung above the fireplace. His good hat was on the peg by the door, still there because she had not been able to bring herself to move it. His handwriting was on the inside cover of the ledger open on the table beside her. The inventory he had done in February before the fever took him. The last full accounting of what they had and what they owed. She was not sentimental, generally. She did not believe in crying over what couldn't be undone, but she sat at the table for a long time that night. In the morning, she went back to the corral. By the end of the second week, Thundervale was eating from the bucket while she stood 6 feet away. By the end of the third week, she could stand at his shoulder without him moving off, though he trembled when she first reached up to touch the crest of his neck, a fine trembling like a tuning fork after you've struck it, the vibration of something that has been wound very tight for a very long time. She put her hand on his neck. He stood still. She did not push it further that day. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands and held it there for a minute, not crying, just feeling the weight of the moment, which was larger than she had expected it to be. The specific gravity of something going right after so many things going wrong. It was Samuel, a week later, who said what she had been thinking. He came to lean on the corral fence in the late afternoon while she was inside with Thundervale, the horse now tolerating her presence along his entire left side, letting her run her hands down his neck and shoulder and partway down his flank before the trembling got too strong and she had to stop and wait. "He ain't angry," Samuel said. She looked up at him. "I've been watching him," Samuel said. 25 years of angry horses. I know what they look like. That ain't anger." He paused. "That's fear that's been alone so long, it don't know what else to be." She looked at the horse beside her. His eye was on Samuel at the fence, watchful but not explosive. He was learning the difference between threat and presence, slowly, the way all things learn it, through repeated evidence that the presence would not become a threat. "That's what I thought too," she said. "The first day, at the auction." "What made you sure enough to spend your last dollar on him?" She thought about this. "I wasn't sure," she said. "I was—" She paused, looking for the word. "I was willing to find out." Samuel was quiet for a while. "That's a different thing from sure," he said. "Most things worth doing are," she said. He made a sound that might have been agreement and pushed off the fence and went back to whatever he had been doing, and she stayed in the corral with the black stallion in the fading October light and thought about how strange and particular hope was, how it didn't announce itself, didn't come with certainty attached, just arrived sometimes in the shape of a trembling horse standing still under your hand, and you had to decide whether that was enough to keep going. She decided it was. What she did not know yet was that Charles Bennett had also been watching, not the horse, not her work in the corral. He had been watching the bank's timeline, watching her finances with the careful attention of a man who knows the exact shape of someone else's difficulty, because he has been in conversation with the people who hold the paper on it. Bennett had friends at the bank. He had always had friends at the bank. It was one of the things he had built his position on, knowing things before other people knew them, being in the right conversations, making sure the men who held the levers of the local economy understood that their interests and his were the same. He had made 3 offers on Abigail Parker's land. She had refused all 3. I was not accustomed to being refused. He was not accustomed to it, and he did not enjoy it, and he had made a private decision, sometime in the summer, that by spring her refusal would cease to matter because the choice would cease to be hers. The note would come due. She would not make it. The bank would foreclose, and he would be in a position to acquire the land, with its water rights, with its access to the valley's best summer pasture, with its particular strategic position between his 2 existing parcels, at a price determined by the bank's need to resolve the situation quickly, which would be considerably less than what he'd offered her. He had been patient. He could be patient a little longer. What he did not know, in October of 1884, sitting in his large house with his large fire and his several glasses of whiskey and his excellent opinion of himself, was that Daniel Parker had been a careful man. Daniel Parker had been a careful man who kept very good records, and in the back of the bottom drawer of the oak desk in the ranch's front room, behind the ledgers and the invoices and the certificates of sale for every head of cattle the ranch had ever bought or sold, there was a locked tin box. Abigail knew the box was there. She had not opened it yet. She had not opened it because Daniel had shown it to her the winter before he died and told her, in the casual way he told her things he considered important, that it contained paperwork she might need someday, and that someday was when something went wrong that needed setting right. She had been afraid to open it because opening it meant acknowledging that Daniel had known something might go wrong, that he had thought ahead to a time when she might need to fight for something. She sat at the kitchen table on the 32nd day after the auction, with the bank letter and the ledger and the cold tea, and she thought about the locked tin box. Then she got up and went to the desk and opened the bottom drawer. The tin box was heavier than she remembered. Abigail set it on this kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. The lock was a small brass thing, the kind that came with a flathead key. She knew where the key was. Daniel had shown her. It lived on the same ring as the key to the barn, padlock, and the key to the strongbox under the floorboard in the bedroom. 3 keys together, which she had carried in her coat pocket every day since the funeral without once using any of them. She found the right key on the first try. The box opened. Inside were papers, folded and organized with the particular neatness of a man who understood that someday someone else would need to find things quickly. Daniel had labeled each document in his careful, slanted handwriting. Deed of title, original, 1871. Mortgage note, First Bank of Red Creek, 1879. Survey record, Parker Homestead, sections 14 through 17. Water rights certificate, issued territorial government, 1873. And at the bottom, beneath all of these, a document she did not immediately recognize. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was good quality, heavy and cream-colored, the kind used for official correspondence. The letterhead at the top read Territorial Land Office, Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the date on it was March of 1882, 14 months before Daniel died. She read it twice, slowly. Then she sat down because her legs had stopped working properly. The document was a formal acknowledgement, a response to a letter Daniel had apparently written to the Territorial Land Office the previous January, inquiring about the status of a claim that had been filed against the Parker Homestead's water rights. The Territorial Office's response was precise and official, and very, very clear. The claim filed by the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium, which was Charles Bennett's legal business name, which she knew because she had read his offer letters carefully, was invalid. The water rights attached to the Parker homestead had been granted under a Territorial Act of 1869, predating the consortium's filing by 4 years, and could not be superseded under existing territorial law. Daniel had known. He had known that Bennett was trying to build a legal claim against their water rights. He had investigated it. He had received official documentation proving the claim was invalid, and he had filed it in the tin box and told her there was paperwork she might need someday. And then he had died before he could tell her any of the details. She sat at the table with the document in her hands and felt something move through her that was too complicated to name easily. Grief and anger, and a strange, fierce tenderness for the man who had quietly handled this fight. She hadn't known was happening, who had protected her from it even while he was already sick, even in the months when she could see him thinning, could see the fever taking hold, could see him spending energy he didn't have on things he didn't tell her about. "You knew," she said, to the empty kitchen, to the hat still on the peg by the door, to whatever remained of Daniel Parker in the space he had occupied for 8 years of her life. "You knew what he was trying to do." She looked at the document again. If Bennett's water rights claim was invalid, and the Territorial Land Office said clearly that it was, then the foundation of his pressure on her was built on nothing. He had been telling her, through intermediaries and through the barely concealed implications of his offer letters, that she was in a weak legal position, that the water rights were in dispute, that any buyer would face years of expensive litigation to resolve the question. That was why his offer was $800. That was why he kept coming back with lower numbers. He was pricing in a conflict that he had manufactured and that the territorial government had already resolved. She put the document back in the tin box and locked it. In the morning, she asked Samuel to drive her into town. Red Creek's lawyer was a man named Elias Croft, who operated out of a narrow office above the hardware store. Croft was 60 years old and had been practicing law in Wyoming since before it was a territory, and he had the particular manner of very old lawyers who have seen enough human behavior that almost nothing surprises them anymore. He read the Territorial Land Office document without expression, took off his glasses, cleaned them with a pocket square, put them back on, and read it again. "Where did you get this?" he said. "My husband had it," Abigail said. "He requested it from the Territorial Office in Cheyenne 14 months before he died." Croft was quiet for a moment. Daniel Parker was a more careful man than most people in this town gave him credit for. "Yes," Abigail said. "He was. And you are aware that Charles Bennett has been representing, in various conversations around this county, that your water rights are subject to a legitimate competing claim." "I've been made aware of the implication," Abigail said. "Not directly. He never said it directly. It was always implied, offered as a reason why my position was weaker than I might believe." Croft picked up the document again. "This makes his claim invalid on its face. He may attempt to argue other grounds, But this, he tapped the paper. This is a territorial government document. It supersedes any local filing. He paused. Mrs. Parker, are you asking me to represent you? She looked at him. What would that cost? He named a number. It was less than she expected. She looked at him more carefully. I have been watching Mr. Bennett's business practices for some time, Croft said, with the careful neutrality of a man choosing words with great deliberateness. I would consider a favorable payment arrangement. I appreciate that, Abigail said. Yes, I'm asking you to represent me. She walked out of Croft's office and down the stairs and into the street, and she stood on the boardwalk for a moment with the cold October air on her face and thought, now the real trouble starts. She was right. It started 3 days later. She was working in the East Corral with Thunder Vale. They had reached the point where she could walk beside him along the fence line, his shoulder level with hers, both of them moving at the same pace, which Samuel had observed from the gate with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that in a less contained man she would have called wonder, when she heard the wagon coming up the road. It was not a delivery wagon. The sound was wrong for that. Too fast. 2 horses instead of 1. She climbed the fence and looked toward the road in time to see a rig she recognized. Bennett's personal buggy, black lacquer with red wheel spokes, the kind of vehicle that announced its owner's opinion of himself before it had cleared the gate. Bennett was not driving it. A man named Tolliver was driving it, one of Bennett's hands, a thick-necked man who had served 2 years in the territorial prison for reasons that were not publicly discussed, but were generally understood. Tolliver brought the buggy to a stop at the gate, and got down and opened the gate without being invited, which told her everything she needed to know about the purpose of the visit before anyone said a word. Bennett stepped down from the buggy. How was dressed for town rather than for a ranch visit. Long coat, good boots, the kind of hat that cost more than most men in Red Creek made in a month. He stood at the gate and looked at the corral and the horse in it, and then at her, standing on the top rail with a coil of lead rope in her hand. Mrs. Parker, he said, I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, she said, but come in anyway. He walked to the corral fence. Tolliver stayed by the buggy. Thunder Vale had moved to the far side of the corral the moment the buggy came through the gate. He was standing there now, head up, watching Bennett with the particular fixed attention he reserved for things he had decided were threats. How's the horse? Bennett said. Better every day, she said. He put one boot on the bottom rail of the fence and leaned his arms on the top rail in the comfortable way of a man who has made himself at home in other people's spaces for so long he no longer notices he's doing it. I heard you went to see Elias Croft. She said nothing. That's your right, of course, he said. A widow managing a complicated estate, it makes sense to get legal advice. He paused. I just want to make sure you understand your situation clearly before you spend money on lawyers that might be better applied toward your banknote. My situation, Abigail said, is that I own this land, the water rights attached to it, and a horse that everyone told me was worthless. I'm doing fine with all 3. Bennett smiled. The banknote comes due in 84 days. I'm aware. $200 short, I hear. She looked at him directly. I don't know where you heard that, and I'd be interested in knowing how the details of my bank account became your information, but it doesn't change anything. Something shifted in his expression. Not much. A slight hardening around the eyes, the smile staying in place while the warmth behind it, which had never been warmth, really, just the performance of it, went away entirely. I'm trying to help you, he said. You're trying to buy my land at a price that benefits you considerably more than it benefits me, she said. I understand that's business, Mr. Bennett, and I don't hold it against you as a principle, but I'm not selling. The water rights claim is invalid, she said, as of a ruling from the Territorial Land Office in March of 1882. I have the documentation. The silence that followed was the most satisfying silence she had experienced in a very long time. Bennett's boot came off the bottom rail. His posture changed. Not dramatically, not enough that a person watching from the road would notice, but enough that she noticed, standing 6 feet away and paying close attention. The easy assurance went somewhere. What replaced it was not anger, not yet. It was calculation. She watched him run the numbers, assess the new information, rework the map of this situation he had believed he understood completely. Daniel had that document, he said. Yes, she said, for 2 years. 14 months, she said. He was precise about things like that. Bennett looked at her. She looked back. My offer stands, he said finally. $800. Good money for land in your position. My position is that I own land with clear water rights and a valid deed, she said. My offer is that it's not for sale. He turned and walked back to the buggy without another word. Tolliver had been watching from the gate. He watched Bennett walk past him and climb into the buggy and waited until Bennett had settled before he looked back at Abigail, one long flat look that was not quite a threat, but was designed to sit in the same neighborhood as one. And then he climbed up and took the reins and turned the buggy back toward the road. She watched them go. Then she turned back to the corral. Thunder Vale had moved while she wasn't looking. He was no longer at the far side. He was at the near fence, 10 feet from where she was standing, his head over the top rail, looking in the direction the buggy had gone with his ears forward and his nostrils working. You don't like him either, Abigail said. The stallion turned his head and looked at her. That makes 2 of us, she said. Samuel was behind her. She hadn't heard him come up. Trouble, he said. The kind that doesn't go away when you tell it to, she said. He was quiet for a moment. What did he want? To let me know he knew about my finances, she said, and to test whether I had anything that would change the situation. I think he expected I didn't. And? He knows now that I do, she said, which means the next move will be something different. Samuel chewed on that for a moment. Different how? I don't know yet, she said, but I intend to find out before he makes it. She went inside and wrote a letter to Elias Croft that night, detailing Bennett's visit, the specific claim he had referenced, and the fact that he had somehow acquired information about the balance on her banknote, which suggested he had a source inside the bank. She sealed the letter and gave it to Samuel to deliver in the morning. Then she went to bed and lay awake for 2 hours, thinking about 84 days and $182, and a man who had been building a trap for her since before her husband was in the ground, and about a black stallion who had moved to the fence when Bennett arrived, as if he understood the geometry of the situation, as if he understood that some presences were threats and some were not, and that the difference mattered. The next morning, she went to the corral before breakfast. Thunder Vale was waiting at the gate, not pressed against it, not anxious. Standing 3 feet back from the rails, square on all 4 feet, ears forward, watching the path from the house to the corral, with an attention that was not fear, but something considerably closer to expectation. She stopped walking. He did not move. She took 1 step toward the gate. He took 1 step toward the gate. She stopped again. Her throat tightened with something that she identified, after a moment, as the particular happiness that comes from a thing you have worked very hard for, arriving exactly as you hoped it would, and being somehow larger than you expected. Good morning, she said. Thunder Vale stretched his head over the top rail, and she reached up slowly, and laid her hand on the flat of his nose, and he held still. And the morning was cold and clear, and the mountains were bright white against the blue sky, and it was the best moment she had had since February. Samuel saw it from across the yard. He turned away quickly, the way a man does when he is witnessing something private, something that belongs to the 2 people, or the person and the horse, who are in the center of it. What Abigail did not see was that there was a 3rd person watching, a boy named Pete Garvey, 11 years old, whose father worked the small farm south of the Parker property, had a habit of cutting across the corner of her land on his way to school when the road was muddy. He had been doing it for 3 years, with Daniel's permission, and then, after a brief, uncertain pause, with Abigail's silent tolerance. Pete was a quiet boy who liked animals with the sincere and uncomplicated love of children, who have not yet been taught to be self-conscious about it. He had seen Thunder Vale in the East Corral for 3 weeks now. He had been watching, from a careful distance, in the way of children who understand instinctively that some things will stop happening if you draw attention to yourself. This morning he stopped at the corner of the fence and watched Abigail's hand on Thundervale's nose, and then he continued to school, and at school he told 3 people what he had seen. By evening, those 3 people had each told 2 more. By the following morning, the shape of what was happening at the Parker Ranch, the widow, the impossible horse, the quiet daily work that was somehow, impossibly, producing results, had moved through Red Creek the way things move through small towns, which is to say, completely and at a speed that would have impressed a telegraph operator. Some people said it was luck. Some said it was temporary. Some said the horse would revert, and she would get hurt, and they would be sad about it, but not surprised. Henry Walsh, who owned the saddle shop and had the kind of practical, unromantic intelligence that sometimes passes for wisdom in a western town, said something different. He said it to his wife over supper, and his wife said it to the women at the church quilting circle, and from there it spread in its own particular direction. "She's not training that horse," Henry Walsh said. "She's listening to him. And it turns out nobody ever did that before." The women at the quilting circle absorbed this information with the particular thoughtful silence of women who recognize in it something true about their own experience. And the conversation moved on, but the thought stayed. Abigail did not know any of this. She was working. The days had taken on a rhythm that she found, to her own surprise, genuinely sustaining. Mornings with Thunder Vale. Always the same approach, the same quiet investment of time and attention, never asking for more than he was ready to give. Afternoons on the ranch work that never finished. The fences, the winterizing of the equipment, the inventory of hay stores for the cold months, the endless small repairs that a property makes necessary when you are running it with 2 people instead of 5. Evenings with the ledger and the letters and the problem of $182 that she did not have. She had written to her sister in Denver. Her sister had written back with love and concern and $20, which was everything her sister could spare. She had taken in 2 more commissions for mending and accepted payment for a load of hay she had been intending to keep for her own horses. She had sold Daniel's good pocket watch to the jeweler in town, which had cost her something that was not money. She had gone over the ranch's accounts with a thoroughness that left her certain she had found every possible dollar that could be found, and what she had found was $311, which was $101 more than the bank required. She had enough. She had enough, but barely, and with almost nothing left over, and the satisfaction of that number was threaded through with the awareness of how close the margin was and how many things could go wrong between now and the day the note came due. It was in this state of careful, precarious sufficiency that the second thing happened. She was in town, at the general store, when she heard the name. She was waiting for Marcus Henley, the store owner, to fill her order of salt and coffee and lamp oil, and 2 women were talking near the dry goods section, their voices low. And she was not trying to overhear, but the store was small and quiet, and the women were not being particularly careful. "The deed," one of the women said. "Or something about the deed. I don't know the details, but I heard he has a document." "Bennett? From before the Parkers bought the place. Something about the original grant. Dorothy's husband was at the recorder's office when someone brought it in." The other woman made a sound. "You don't think—" "I don't know. But Dorothy said the man who brought it in was Tolliver." Abigail paid for her order and walked out. She went directly to Elias Croft's office. Howe was there. He listened to what she had heard without interruption, his hands folded on his desk, his expression in the same careful neutrality he maintained about everything. "Tell me exactly what was said," he said when she finished. She told him, word for word. Croft was quiet for a long time. "If Bennett has brought a document to the recorder's office that purports to challenge the original land grant on your property," he said slowly, "then he has shifted his strategy. He is no longer trying to buy you out. He is attempting to manufacture a legal challenge to your title itself. Can he do that?" "He can file the challenge," Croft said. "The question is whether it has merit." He paused. "I would like to see the original deed of title from your tin box, and the survey record. If your husband's documents are as thorough as this suggests, they should be sufficient to establish clear title. But I want to see them before I tell you that with confidence." She brought the tin box to his office the following morning. He spent 4 hours with the documents while she waited in the outer room on a hard wooden chair, listening to the sounds of the street below and the wind picking up outside and the dry scratch of Croft's pen as he took notes. When he came out, his expression had not changed, but something in the set of his shoulders had. "Your title is clear," he said. She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, since the general store. "Your husband's paperwork is exceptional," Croft continued. "The original grant, the survey, the territorial water rights certificate, everything is in order and properly recorded. Whatever Bennett has brought to the recorder's office, it cannot supersede these documents." He paused. "But I want you to understand something, Mrs. Parker. A man in Bennett's position does not file a legal challenge because he believes he will win in court. He files it because the process itself costs you time, money, and energy. He is creating drag, making the fight expensive enough that you decide the land is not worth the cost of keeping it." "He misjudges how much the land is worth to me," Abigail said. "He also misjudges something else," Croft said, and for the first time she heard something in his voice that was not neutrality, something dry and pointed, something that in a less composed man she would have called anger. "He does not know that I have been quietly collecting records of certain transactions Mr. Bennett has conducted in this county over the last decade. Transactions that involved other struggling property owners. Transactions that involved, in 2 cases, documents of questionable origin." Abigail looked at him. "Daniel Parker is not the first man in this county to have noticed that something was wrong," Croft said. "He is, to my knowledge, the first man to have done something specific and documented about it." He paused. "I intend to make use of that." She sat with this for a moment. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Your patience," he said. "And your signatures on several things." He paused again. "And possibly something more, in a few weeks. There are people who will not speak officially unless they believe the case can be won. Your husband's documents may be what convinces them it can." She nodded. "Whatever you need." She drove home in the cold November afternoon, with the mountains going dark orange and pink at the western edge and the first real threat of snow in the air. And she thought about Daniel sitting at that desk in the front room with his pen and his careful handwriting, documenting things, keeping records, building a case that he had never expected to need but had prepared anyway, because he was that kind of man. She had married him when she was 19 years old, because he had made her laugh twice in one conversation, and had seemed, in some fundamental way she couldn't articulate but absolutely trusted, like a person who would be reliable in the dark. She had been right. When she got back to the ranch, she went to the East Corral. Thundervale came to the fence when he heard her footsteps on the path. Not running, not charging. Walking, steady and deliberate, the way a creature moves when it has decided, somewhere in the private territory of its own nature, that a particular presence is safe. He came to the rail and put his head over it, and she put both hands on the sides of his face, warm and heavy in her palms, his breath misting in the cold air against her wrists, and she stood there for a while without saying anything. "We're going to be all right," she said finally. His ears moved forward and then back to the comfortable half position they had begun to take, the one that meant he was relaxed, the one that 3 weeks ago she would not have believed she would ever see on this horse. "Both of us," she said. Samuel came out of the barn and saw her at the fence and stopped walking. He was carrying a lantern for the evening check of the other horses, and the light swung with him as he stopped, casting long shadows across the yard. He looked at the horse. He looked at her. He said nothing. He walked on to the barn. It was, she thought, exactly the right response. What came 3 days later was not. She was at breakfast when she heard the hoofbeats, fast and multiple, more than 2 horses, coming up the road with the particular urgency of people who are not coming to pay a social call. She went to the window. 4 riders. She recognized one of them, Tom Aldridge, who sat on the town council and whose face wore, at the moment, the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else doing anything else. She went to the door before they had finished dismounting. "Tom," she said. Aldridge took off his hat. "Abigail, I'm sorry for the early hour." "What is it?" He looked at the other 3 men. None of them were looking at her directly. The bank received a letter yesterday from a legal representative filing on behalf of the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium, Aldridge said. The letter claims, and I want to be clear, this is their claim and not a determination. It is not a determination. It claims that there is a defect in the original land grant for this property dating to 1869, and that the grant should be considered provisional pending a review. A defect, Abigail said. That is the claim. On what basis? Aldridge shifted his weight. They are claiming that the man who filed the original grant, your husband's father, Matthew Parker, was not legally resident in the territory at the time of filing, which would make the grant procedurally invalid. She looked at him. Matthew Parker built his first structure on this land in the spring of 1868 and has the records to prove it. My husband had those records. I don't doubt that, Aldridge said. Abigail, I want to be honest with you. I don't believe this claim has merit. But the bank's position is that while the claim is pending, they are required to, they feel they need to, hold any disposition of the note in abeyance, pending resolution. They're freezing my account, she said. They are delaying action on the note, he said carefully. That is the same thing, Tom. He had the grace to look pained. There may be a path forward, if the claim can be resolved quickly. How long does a resolution take? She said. He was quiet. Tom, how long? In ordinary circumstances, he said, a territorial title review takes... He paused. Between 6 months and a year. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Behind her, in the kitchen, the fire crackled and the clock ticked, and the world continued turning with the thoroughgoing indifference the world applies to individual people's crises. Thank you for coming to tell me yourself, she said to Aldridge. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, afterward, that her voice was even. I'll be in touch with Mr. Croft today. Aldridge nodded. He put his hat back on. He said, as he turned to his horse, very quietly, so the other men might not have heard it. He's overstepped this time, Abigail. I think he knows it. I think that's why he's moving so fast. She absorbed that. She went inside and sat at the table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed steadily, in through the nose and out through the mouth, the way she had stood in the East Corral with Thunder Vale exploding around her. She did not run. She did not leave. She sat still and waited for the panic to peak and begin to subside, and when it did, she picked up her pen and began to write. She wrote 3 letters that morning and sent Samuel to town with all of them before noon. The first went to Elias Croft, with every detail of Tom Aldridge's visit and the exact language of the bank's position. The second went to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, requesting certified copies of all documentation related to the original Parker Homestead grant, addressed to Croft's office. The third went to her sister in Denver, not asking for money this time, but for a name. Her sister's husband worked in the territorial government. Abigail wanted to know if there was anyone in Cheyenne who remembered the 1869 land grants, anyone who had been in the office long enough to have handled Matthew Parker's original application. Then she went to the corral. She went because she needed to think, and she thought better near the horse. Thunder Vale came to the rail when she arrived, the way he had been doing for 6 days now, consistent and deliberate, and she put her hand on the curve of his neck and stood there without talking, which she rarely did. And he stood with her in the particular quiet of a creature that has learned that silence alongside a trusted person is not emptiness, but a different kind of communication. She was thinking about timing. Bennett had filed his challenge 3 days after her conversation with Croft, which meant one of 2 things. Either he had been preparing the challenge for weeks and had simply accelerated his timeline when he discovered she had the water rights documentation, or he had someone in Croft's office who reported the conversation. She did not want to believe the second thing. Croft had been practicing law in this county for 30 years and had the reputation of a man who ran a tight office. But reputations and facts were not always the same thing. She stood at the fence and thought about who else had been in Croft's waiting room the morning she sat there for 4 hours. 2 men she didn't know, a woman with a young child, and Marcus Henley's bookkeeper, a thin young man named Doyle, who handled accounts for 3 of the largest businesses in Red Creek, including, she suddenly remembered, the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium. She was still thinking about this when the sound reached her. Hoofbeats again. Single horse, coming fast, and before she finished turning, she saw Pete Garvey coming across the south corner of her property at a dead run, not on the road, cross-country, crouched low on a horse that was blowing hard. He pulled up at the fence and was off before the horse stopped moving. Mrs. Parker. He was breathing hard. His face was the color of chalk. There's men. At the north fence. 2 of them. I saw them from the ridge when I was coming back from the mill. She went very still. What were they doing? One of them was looking at the fence posts. The other one... Pete swallowed. The other one had a lantern. Mrs. Parker, it wasn't even dark yet. She looked at Samuel, who had appeared from the direction of the barn, with the particular silent speed of a man who has spent 60 years paying attention to things that matter. Get the rifle, she said. Samuel was already moving. Pete, she said, go home. Go directly home and stay there. I can help. You can help by being somewhere that isn't here, she said. Go. He went. She gave him credit for not arguing. She and Samuel crossed the north pasture on foot, moving parallel to the fence line, but staying in the cover of the trees that ran along the creek bed. Samuel with the rifle, and Abigail with Daniel's old revolver that she had loaded that morning without knowing why. Some instinct from the previous night's sleeplessness, putting her through the motions of preparation before she had a conscious reason to prepare. They heard the men before they saw them. 2 voices, low, one giving instructions, one acknowledging them. The creak of something being pried. A metallic sound she identified after a moment as wire. She stepped out of the trees. The 2 men were at the corner post of the north fence, the post that anchored the section nearest the creek crossing. One of them was working at the base of the post with a pry bar, working it loose from the ground. The other had a coil of wire cutters hanging from his belt, and a lantern sitting on the ground beside him, already lit, the flame orange in the late afternoon gray. They saw her at the same moment. The one with the pry bar straightened up. The one with the wire cutters reached for something at his hip. I wouldn't, Samuel said, from her left, and his voice had a quality she had never heard from him before. Not loud, not theatrical, but absolutely without any of the softness that usually lived at the bottom of his sentences. The rifle was up. The man's hand stopped. Abigail looked at both of them. She did not recognize either one. They had the look of men who hired out for work that did not bear close examination. Not rough in the obvious way, but with a particular careful blankness in their faces. The expression of men who have learned that being forgettable is a professional asset. You're on my property, she said. The one with the pry bar said nothing. You are loosening a fence post on my property, she said, with a lit lantern sitting on the ground beside you. I would like you to explain that. Nothing. Samuel, she said. Ma'am, Samuel said. I think we should take these men into town, she said. I think Sheriff Briggs should hear their explanation, since they don't seem interested in offering it to me. The one with the wire cutters looked at the one with the pry bar. Something passed between them. A decision. The one with the pry bar set the tool down, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who wants to make sure everyone in the immediate vicinity understands that he is not making a sudden move. We made a mistake, he said. Wrong property. Wrong property, Abigail repeated. We were hired to check fence line on the Bennett parcel. Must have gotten confused in the dark. It isn't dark, she said. It's 4 in the afternoon, and the Bennett parcel is 1.5 miles north of here, with a creek and a ridge between you and it. The man said nothing. I'm going to ask you to leave my property, she said, and I'm going to remember your faces. And if I see either of you within sight of this fence line again, the next conversation we have will be with the sheriff present, and it will not be optional. They left. She watched them until they were out of sight. Then she looked at the base of the corner post where the pry bar had been working. The post had been loosened, the packed earth around its base disturbed, but not enough to bring it down. 10 more minutes of work, and they would have had it out. A fence post out at the corner of the north section, near the creek crossing, with a lit lantern nearby on a dry November afternoon. She looked at Samuel, who was looking at this post too, His jaw set in a way that added years to his face. "He was going to burn the north fence," she said. "Looks that way," Samuel said. "Why the north fence?" He turned and looked across the pasture, working out the angles the way a man who has spent his life on working land does, instinctively reading terrain and consequence. "North fence goes, the horses in the upper pasture get out. Horses out, you're spending days rounding them up. Fence fire in dry November grass, it spreads before you can stop it." He paused. "You lose the upper pasture hay stores, maybe the barn, depending on wind." She absorbed this. "I wants me running in every direction," she said. "Too busy to fight him in court." "Or too broke," Samuel said. "Replace that fence, replace what burns. That's money you don't have to spend on lawyers." She looked at the loosened post and the lantern. The men had left behind in their hurry. They had forgotten the lantern, she noticed, or decided it wasn't worth retrieving. It was a good lantern, newer than anything she owned. "Pick that up," she said. "I want Croft to see it." Samuel picked it up. That night she did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with Daniel's rifle within arm's reach and the revolver on the table beside her coffee cup, and she listened to the sounds of the ranch in the dark. The horses in the upper pasture, the wind, the distant coyotes, the particular creaking of the house that she knew by frequency and had learned, in the months of living alone, to distinguish from sounds that required investigation. Nothing came. But she sat up anyway, because some nights the point is not what happens, but what you refuse to let happen by staying awake. In the morning, she drove herself to Croft's office. She told him everything. The men at the fence post, the lantern, Pete Garvey's account of what he'd seen from the ridge. Croft listened with the stillness of a man in whom information is settling into a pattern he has been watching develop for a long time. "He's accelerating," Croft said. "Because he's worried," Abigail said. "Because he's worried," Croft confirmed. He leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Parker, I received this morning a response to a letter I sent to Cheyenne 3 weeks ago. I had asked a colleague there about certain land transactions in this county over the past decade, specifically about 3 properties that were foreclosed or sold under distressed circumstances after legal challenges appeared against their titles." He paused. The challenges in each case were filed by the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium. In each case, the challenges were subsequently found to be without merit. But in each case, the property owner had already sold or been foreclosed upon before the challenge was resolved. Abigail felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November air coming under Croft's door. "He's done this before," she said. 3 times that I can confirm," Croft said. "Possibly more. The pattern is clear enough. Identify a struggling property with desirable assets, manufacture a legal challenge against the title, work the banking relationships to freeze or accelerate the note, acquire the property at a distressed price before the challenge is ever tested in court." He paused. "He has never had to go to court, Mrs. Parker, because the property owners have always given in before it came to that." "I expected me to give in," she said. "He expected you to give in quickly," Croft said. "I believe the fence incident suggests that your failure to do so has made him impatient." She thought about this. "The other property owners," she said. "Are they still in the county?" Croft looked at her. "The ones who sold," she said. "Where are they now?" "2 of them left the territory," he said. "One family, the Emersons, over near Powder River, are still here. Farming, not ranching. They lost their original land 3 years ago." "Would they talk?" Abigail said. Croft was quiet for a long moment. "If they believed the case could be won," he said. "If they believed that coming forward would result in something more than another loss." "Then we need to give them a reason to believe that," she said. She was back at the ranch by noon, and she went to the East Corral, because the East Corral was where she went when she needed to think, and the thinking felt impossible. Thunder Vale was not at the gate today. He was at the center of the corral, moving in a loose circle, not the explosive panicked circuits of the early weeks, but something more like what she recognized when she let herself, as play. Long, easy strides, his tail up, his head swinging. He heard her at the fence and slowed and turned and looked at her, and then he came toward her at a walk. She put her arms over the top rail and watched him come. He stopped a foot away. She could count the changes since the auction. 8 weeks ago, he would not tolerate her inside the corral. 6 weeks ago, he had taken grain from her hand, but trembled when she moved. 4 weeks ago, he had stood while she groomed his neck and shoulder. 2 weeks ago, she had put a blanket on his back for the first time, not a saddle, just the weight of the fabric, and he had stood with his whole body tense and vibrating, every muscle locked, for 17 minutes. And then something in him had released, and he had dropped his head and breathed, and she had taken the blanket off and given him the rest of the afternoon. Last week, she had put the blanket on twice. He had tensed for 3 minutes the first time and 2 minutes the second. She was not rushing. She was, she thought, doing the opposite of what every person who had owned this horse before her had done. They had pushed. They had had timelines and goals and an endpoint in mind, a definition of success that was their definition, imposed on an animal that had a completely different set of experiences and a completely different understanding of what trust was for. She had no endpoint. She had a direction. The distinction, Samuel had told her last week, with the particular terseness of a man paying someone a significant compliment, was everything. She was still at the fence when she heard the wagon. Not a fast approach this time. A single horse, slow, pulling a light wagon, coming up the road with no particular urgency, which was why she didn't move away from the corral until the wagon had pulled through the gate and she turned and saw who was driving it. Martha Emerson was 50 years old, wide-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been pretty in a soft way and was now handsome in a harder way, the prettiness refined by difficulty into something more durable. She was alone in this wagon. She was wearing her good dress, which told Abigail that this visit had been decided upon deliberately and dressed for. Abigail walked toward the gate. Martha Emerson climbed down from the wagon and stood beside it and did not move closer, as if she was giving Abigail the choice of whether to close the distance between them. Abigail closed it. "Mrs. Emerson," she said. "Mrs. Parker." Martha Emerson looked at her steadily. "I heard you went to see Elias Croft." Word traveled in Red Creek like water in a flat pan. You couldn't pour it anywhere without it finding everywhere. "I did," Abigail said. "I heard he's been asking about properties Bennett took," Martha Emerson said. "About how he did it." "Yes," Abigail said. Martha Emerson looked away for a moment, at the mountains, at the sky, at some middle distance where the decision she was making was apparently located. "He took my husband's land 3 years ago," she said. "You know that." "I know," Abigail said. "My husband was never the same after," Martha Emerson said. Her voice was level, the level of someone who has said a true and painful thing so many times that the saying of it no longer costs what it once did, but the thing itself is still there, still present, still exactly the same weight. "He died last spring. He held on long enough to see the children grown, and then he just let go. I've always believed the land had something to do with it. That losing it the way they did, without any recourse, without anyone believing it was possible to fight. I've always believed that took something out of him that never came back." Abigail did not say anything. Some things didn't need a response. "I kept all the documents," Martha Emerson said. "From before, from during. The original challenge, the bank's letters, everything. My husband kept everything. He was like that." She paused. "I kept them because I always thought someday someone would need them. I just never thought it would take this long." She reached into the wagon and lifted out a cloth bag, the kind used for flour, tied at the top. She held it out to Abigail. "I talked to Elias Croft last week," she said. "He said you were the one who found the territorial water rights document, that you had Daniel's tin box." She paused. "He said you weren't going to fold." "I'm not," Abigail said. Martha Emerson's expression changed in a way that Abigail felt in her own chest. A release of something held for a very long time, not all the way gone, maybe never all the way gone, but eased. "I'd like to see him held responsible," she said, "while I'm still alive to see it." Abigail took the bag. It was heavier than she expected. "There are letters in there," Martha Emerson said, "including one that's in Bennett's handwriting, not signed with his name, He was too careful for that. But my husband recognized the handwriting and documented when and where he received it. It's a letter suggesting that a certain bank officer would be making a decision in the consortium's favor within the week. My husband wrote the date and the name of the man he believed sent it on the outside of the envelope. Abigail looked at this bag in her hands. "That's what you've been holding on to for 3 years," she said. "I was waiting," Martha Emerson said, "for someone who could actually use it." She climbed back into her wagon and picked up the reins. "My husband's name was Robert," she said. "Robert James Emerson. He built that land up from nothing. He was a good man." She looked at Abigail steadily. "Don't let Bennett bury another one." She drove back out through the gate. Abigail stood in the yard holding the flour sack and watched her go. Samuel came out of the barn. "What is that?" he said. "The thing that changes everything," Abigail said. She took the bag to Croft that afternoon. Croft read for 40 minutes without speaking. Abigail sat in the hard wooden chair and watched his expression, which told her nothing except that he was reading carefully, which was all it ever told her. When he put the last paper down, he looked at her over his glasses. "This letter," he said, "in conjunction with your territorial documents and the pattern I have been building with the Cheyenne correspondence, constitutes a substantial case." He paused. "Not a certain case, but substantial. Enough to take before Judge Harlan at the next term." "When is the next term?" Abigail said. 6 weeks, Croft said. "The bank has frozen my account," she said. "Bennett's legal challenge is pending. What happens to my note in the next 6 weeks?" Croft picked up his pen. "I am going to write a letter to the bank this afternoon," he said, "advising them that proceeding on any disposition of your property while a counter-complaint is being prepared would expose them to significant legal liability." He paused. "They will not like it, but they will hold." "Are you certain?" He looked at her over the glasses. "In 30 years of practice, I have found that banks are very responsive to the word liability." He paused again. "I am also going to contact 2 other families who I believe were victims of the same scheme, and who, now that there is a case with real evidence behind it, may be willing to add their accounts. Numbers matter to judges." She drove home in the dark that night, which she did not like and usually avoided, but the conversation had gone longer than she intended. The road was clear, and the horse knew the way, and she had the revolver in her coat pocket, and she used the drive to think, rather than to worry, which was a distinction she had been working on since September. She was thinking about the 6 weeks, about what could go wrong in 6 weeks, and what could go right, about the fact that if Croft's counter-complaint was successful, it would not just protect her land. It would open the door to investigating Bennett's previous acquisitions. It would put the bank officer who had helped him, whoever that was, the name Robert Emerson had written on the outside of the envelope, in a very uncomfortable position. It would, potentially, undo some of the damage that had already been done to families who had lost what they had built. It would not bring back Robert Emerson. She thought about that too. The blizzard arrived in the 3rd week of November without the courtesy of significant warning. Weather in Wyoming did not negotiate. It arrived, and it did what it intended to do, and the only thing a person could do about it was have prepared well enough that the doing of it did not destroy everything you'd built. Abigail had prepared well. She had spent 3 days before the storm buttoning up the ranch, hay stores secured, water troughs checked and refilled, the barn insulated with extra straw, the horses in the upper pasture brought down to the lower paddock where the windbreak was better. She had laid in enough wood for 2 weeks and enough food for 3, and she had done all of this while also driving into town every other day to consult with Croft and to be present, visible, unbroken, because she understood by now that her visibility mattered, that every time she drove into Red Creek and tied her wagon at the post and walked down the street with her head up, she was doing something that was not just personal. People were watching. People who had not decided yet whether to speak, whether to remember certain things out loud, whether to put their names on documents that would make them targets of the same man who had already taken so much. She needed them to see that she was still there. She was still there. The storm hit on a Thursday night, which she spent in the barn. She had moved a cot out there because the horses needed checking through the night, and because the barn was warmer than it had any right to be. The body heat of 6 horses, doing what body heat does in an insulated space. She slept in 2-hour intervals and checked the animals between them and listened to the wind doing extraordinary things to the world outside the barn walls. Thunder Vale was in the barn with the others, in the stall she had prepared for him at the far end, the one with the strongest gate and the most space. She had not been sure, in the days before the storm, whether he would accept the enclosed space. The corral had been his territory for 8 weeks, and horses that have been damaged by confinement sometimes cannot accept being inside again. But she had put his grain in the stall and stood at the gate and talked quietly and left. And when she came back an hour later, he had gone in on his own. The gate was open. He was eating. She had leaned against the barn wall outside his stall and felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight for a long time. In the night, during the storm, she woke to the sound of him moving in his stall. Not the frantic movement of a panicked animal, but the restless shifting of a horse awake in the dark, aware of the storm, not afraid of it, processing it the way a creature processes things when it has reached the place where the world's noise is something to be understood rather than fled. She got up and went to his stall. She put her hand through the gate rails. After a moment, he came to her hand. She stood there for a long time in the dark, with her hand on his face, and the storm doing its work outside, and thought about all the things that had been broken, and were still in the process of becoming something else. Daniel. The ranch. The note. The case that Croft was building. The trust that was growing, slowly and without guarantees, between herself and a horse that everyone had already given up on. She thought about Robert Emerson, who had died holding on to something he could not give back. About Martha Emerson, who had held on to a cloth bag of documents for 3 years because she believed that someday someone would need them. About Elias Croft, who had been collecting evidence in his careful, lawyerly way for a decade, waiting for a case solid enough to take into court. She thought about how long the right things sometimes took, and how the wrong things always seemed to move faster. She thought about 6 weeks. The storm passed by Saturday morning. When she opened the barn doors, the world outside was white and blue and brutally cold and entirely still, the way Wyoming is after a big storm, as if the violence of the weather uses itself up and leaves a silence behind it that is almost startling. She let the horses out into the paddock one at a time. She let Thunder Vale out last. He walked out of the barn and into the snow and stopped. He had never seen snow, or if he had seen it in circumstances that made it a threat, just another element of a world that was generally trying to harm him. He stood at the paddock gate and snorted at the white ground, and then he looked up at the sky, which was the particular bottomless blue that Wyoming delivers after a storm, as if the sky is apologizing. He breathed in. He breathed out. He walked into the snow. Abigail watched from the gate. Samuel was beside her. "He's going to be all right," Samuel said. He was not talking about the snow. "I know," she said. And then Samuel said something she had not expected. "I rode for Bennett," he said. 15 years ago, before I came to work for your father." She turned and looked at him. His face was set in the careful way of a person delivering information. They have been deciding for a long time whether to deliver. "I left because I saw something I didn't like," he said. "A dispute with a neighbor, a fence line, documents that appeared when they shouldn't have. I left and I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure enough, and because I had a family then, and because I told myself it wasn't my fight." He paused. "It's my fight now," he said. "If you need someone to say what I saw in court, I'll say it." She looked at him. In 60 years of reading people and knowing horses and working land that was not his, but that he had tended as if it were, Samuel Whitaker had chosen, she thought, exactly the right moment to say the thing he had been carrying for 15 years. "I'll tell Croft," she said. "Good," he said. They stood together in the cold white morning and watched Thunder Vale move through the snow, carefully at first, then with growing confidence, breaking into a trot along the fence line, his breath coming in white plumes, his coat black against the white ground, moving like something that had decided, at last, that the world might be worth running in. Then she heard it. A sound from the direction of the road, carried clearly in the post-storm stillness. That was not weather and not animals, and not anything the ranch should be producing at 7 in the morning. She turned. The smoke was coming from the direction of the north fence. She ran, not toward the house for more help, not toward the barn for tools, toward the north fence, because in the 3 seconds between seeing the smoke and moving her feet, she had calculated what mattered most. If the fire was at the north fence, it was 40 yards from the hay stores in the upper shelter, and the upper shelter sat directly upwind of the barn, and the barn held 6 horses, including a black stallion who had only just learned that the world was not entirely trying to destroy him. Samuel was already running beside her. He had seen it at the same moment and had not said anything, just moved, the way men who have spent their lives on working land move when something is on fire, without drama, without discussion, with the particular focused speed of someone who knows exactly what they stand to lose. The north fence was burning, not the full line. A section of it, maybe 30 feet. The dry posts catching fast and the bottom rails already gone. The fire moving laterally along the fence line in both directions from what had clearly been the starting point. A concentrated burn at the base of the corner post that they had loosened 3 weeks ago. The post they had redriven and repacked and believed was secure. She understood in an instant. The storm had given cover. Someone had come in the night, during the blizzard, when no one was watching and the wind was loud enough to hide any sound, and had set a slow burn at the base of the post. Something that would smolder through the wet and the cold and catch properly in the morning when the wind died and the air cleared. Whoever had done this understood fire, understood weather, understood her property well enough to know exactly where the burn would travel. Water, she said. They had prepared for this possibility, or for a version of it. She had stationed 2 full barrels at the north fence line after the incident with the pry bar men, which Samuel had thought was prudent, and which she had thought was necessary, and which was now the difference between a manageable problem and a catastrophe. Samuel went for the first barrel. She went for the second, rolling it on its bottom edge across the frozen ground with the particular desperate competence of a person who does not have time to think about the weight, only about the distance. The fire was not yet at the point where water would be useless. She knew that. She also knew it was close to that point. She heard Thundervale screaming from the paddock. Not his old scream. Not the blind explosive panic of the auction yard. But something that carried in it, she would think later, a specific awareness, an alarm. The way horses communicate danger through a herd. The information moving in the sound itself. The other horses in the paddock took it up, and the combined sound of it cut through the cold air and landed somewhere in the part of Abigail that was not focused on the fire and the barrels. He's afraid, she thought. But he's not running. She upended the first barrel at the base of the burning corner post. The fire screamed like a living thing and threw up a cloud of steam and black smoke, and for a moment she could not see anything through it, could not breathe properly, and she held her ground and waited. And when the smoke thinned, the post was out, charred to the soil line but standing, and the lateral burn on the left fence section was slower now, its fuel interrupted. Samuel hit the right section with the second barrel. The fire on that side died faster. The right section posts were newer, the wood less dry, and the water hit it at the right moment, before it had worked fully into the structure. They stood in the steam and the char smell and breathed. The fence was damaged. A full section would need to be replaced. Posts, rails, the whole 30 feet. But the barn was safe. The hay shelter was safe. The horses in the paddock were safe. She looked at the base of the corner post, at the precise origin point of the burn. The post had been reset after the pry bar incident. The earth around it repacked and firmly tamped. But here, at the base, there was evidence of something that had not been there 3 weeks ago. A mark in the frozen ground, partially obscured by the water and the fire damage, that looked like the impression of a boot heel. Someone had been here. Last night. In the blizzard. She looked at Samuel. He was looking at the same mark. "I want to track where they came from," she said. "Ground's too disturbed here," Samuel said. "But there." He pointed to a section of the paddock perimeter, 30 feet to the east, where the snow was undisturbed and white and flat. There might be something. There was. Footprints in the snow, 2 sets, coming from the direction of the road and returning to the road, a straight line with no hesitation, no wandering. The prints of people who knew where they were going. The stride pattern was the measured pace of men, moving carefully through deep snow, not running, not lost, purposeful. She followed them to the fence line where they crossed her property boundary. On the other side of the fence, the tracks continued north, toward the Bennett parcel. She stood at the fence and looked at the tracks in the snow and felt the particular quality of cold that comes from inside rather than outside. The cold of being absolutely certain of something that you cannot yet prove in a way that a court would accept. "I need Croft," she said. "I'll go," Samuel said. "No." She turned. "I need you here. I need Pete Garvey. She went back to the barn and saddled the gray mare, which she could ride faster than she could drive the wagon, and she rode south to the Garvey farm and knocked on the door until Pete's father answered, and she explained what she needed in 60 seconds, and Pete was dressed and on his horse in 5 minutes, his father behind him looking like a man who had made a rapid decision about whose side he was on in something he hadn't fully understood yet. Pete Garvey could draw. She had seen this, had seen him with his school slate rendering the horses in the paddock with a natural accuracy that was better than most grown men could manage with a proper sketch pad. She gave him paper from her coat pocket and a pencil and walked him to the fence line and said, "Draw everything you see, the tracks, the measurements, the direction, everything." He drew for 20 minutes in the cold without complaining. She looked at what he produced. It was good, more than good. It was precise, the stride intervals marked, the direction indicated, the depth of the impressions noted in the margin in his school handwriting, which was better than hers had been at 11. In the bottom corner he had drawn the boot impression at the fire origin without being asked, simply because it was there, and he was thorough. "You're a remarkable boy," she said. Pete Garvey went red to his ears and said nothing. She took the drawing and rode for town. Croft's office door was locked. She knocked until he opened it in his dressing coat, which she had never seen him in, and which told her it was earlier than she had understood. He looked at her face and stood back from the door without asking questions. She put the drawing on his desk. She told him about the fire in the time it took to say it plainly, no more words than necessary. Croft looked at the drawing for a long time. "The boy drew this?" he said. "This morning, an hour ago. From the actual tracks?" "He was standing in the snow when he drew it," she said. "Samuel and I witnessed it." Croft set the drawing down. He looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize as his version of urgency, which on a less composed face would have looked like alarm. "I need to send a letter to Judge Harlan today," he said. "This, combined with the Emerson documents and Samuel's testimony and the incident with the pry-bar men, constitutes a pattern of criminal interference that goes beyond a civil land dispute. This is sabotage, possibly arson." "It is arson," she said. "The fire was deliberately set." "I will need you to document the damage before anything is disturbed," he said. "Samuel should do a written account today. You should do a written account today. And I want a deposition from the Garvey boy, from Pete, within the next 48 hours, while his memory of the morning is exact." "I'll have it," she said. She stood to leave and Croft said, "Mrs. Parker." She turned. "I have been practicing law in this county for 30 years, he said. "In 30 years, I have seen a great deal of powerful men doing harm to people with less power than them, because the people with less power believed they had no recourse." He paused. "You are about to give a great many people recourse." She looked at him. "Don't thank me for that," she said. "Just win." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him. "I intend to," he said. She was back at the ranch by mid-morning. The damaged fence section stood open in the cold, the charred posts a dark gap in the line, and through the gap, Thunder Vale was visible in the paddock, moving in a slow circle along the far fence, burning off whatever the smell of smoke had stirred in him. She watched him for a moment. He was not panicking. He was moving, working through something, the way horses do when they cannot be still but are not out of control, when the energy has to go somewhere and they are choosing where. How is choosing where? That was the thing she kept coming back to. She went inside and wrote her account of the morning. Every detail, in the order it happened, with times as best she could estimate them, and measurements she had paced herself. 32 feet of damaged fence, fire origin at the southwest corner post, 2 barrel loads of water to extinguish, fire fully out by what she estimated was 7:45 in the morning, tracks in the snow running north-northeast to the property boundary. She wrote for 2 hours. When she looked up, Samuel was in the doorway. "Someone else saw it," he said. She put her pen down. "Who?" "Margaret Hollis," Samuel said. "Lives on the North Road, half-mile past your fence line. She was up early with a sick child. Said she saw 2 men on horseback going past her house in the dark, going north. She said one of them was riding a horse she recognized, a pinto with a distinctive gait. She's seen that horse before." "Whose horse?" Abigail said. Samuel's expression was very careful. "Tolliver's," he said. She sat with that for a moment. Tolliver, Bennett's man. The thick-necked man who had stood by the buggy during Bennett's visit, who had driven the buggy himself that day. Tolliver, who had brought the forged document to the county recorder's office. "Will Margaret Hollis say so?" Abigail said. "She's already saying so," Samuel said. "She told 4 people before noon." "That's not the same as a deposition." "No," Samuel said, "but it's a start. And in a town like this, what 4 people know by noon, 12 people know by supper." He was right. She knew he was right because she had lived in Red Creek her whole life, and she understood exactly how information moved through it, how the invisible lines of trust and obligation and shared memory that connected people in a small town could work for or against you, depending entirely on which direction the current was running. The current, she thought, might finally be running in the right direction. She was right. What happened over the next 10 days happened with a speed that surprised even Croft, who had been practicing law long enough to have stopped being surprised by most things. The deposition from Pete Garvey was taken and filed. Margaret Hollis came to Croft's office with her husband and made a formal statement about the pinto horse and the 2 riders in the pre-dawn dark. The second family Croft had been in contact with, the Sullivans, who had lost a property near Bison Creek 2 years ago to a title challenge filed by the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium, came forward with their own documents, including a letter with the same handwriting as the letter in the Emerson bag. And then a man named George Phelps walked into Croft's office on a Tuesday afternoon and sat down in the wooden chair across the desk and told Croft that he had been the bank officer who had passed information about Abigail Parker's account balance to Charles Bennett, and that he was prepared to testify about it, and about 3 previous occasions on which he had done the same for other property owners, in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Croft brought this information to Abigail in person. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday evening, which he had never done before, which told her before he opened his mouth that whatever he was carrying was too significant for the hard wooden chair and the office above the hardware store. She put coffee on, and they sat at the kitchen table. He told her about Phelps. She was very still for a long time. "He told Bennett my account balance," she said. "On at least 2 occasions," Croft said. "So Bennett knew exactly how far I was from making the note," she said. "He knew exactly how much pressure to apply." "Yes," Croft said. She looked at the table. At Daniel's ledger, still sitting where it had been since September, the handwriting on the cover faded at the edges, but still legible, still his. "He calculated it," she said. "He calculated exactly what it would take to make me sell." "Yes," Croft said. "He miscalculated," she said. Croft picked up his coffee. "Considerably," he said. The hearing before Judge Harlan was set for the 2nd week of December. In the days leading up to it, Red Creek did what small towns do with large events. It talked. It talked in the general store and the saddle shop, and at the church, and at the post office, and at the edges of every other conversation happening in every other location in the county. People who had been neutral found themselves choosing. People who had been afraid found themselves. With the particular social momentum of a town that has smelled which way the wind is turning, finding courage they had not previously known they possessed. 3 more people came to Croft with information. Two of them were men who had done work for Bennett that they had not, at the time, understood the full implications of. One of them was a woman whose husband had lost a small ranch 6 years ago, and who had, for 6 years, believed there was nothing to be done about it, and was now revising that belief with a ferocity that Croft described to Abigail as, quietly, one of the more gratifying things he had witnessed in 30 years of practice. Abigail went to the East Corral every morning. Thunder Vale had progressed to the point where she could lead him through the gate and around the perimeter of the paddock with a light rope, walking beside her with the cooperative ease of an animal that has chosen to accompany you rather than the reluctant compliance of one that has been forced to. The difference was visible to anyone who knew what to look for. Samuel knew. He watched from the gate and did not say much, but his silence had changed quality. It was the silence of someone watching something unfold exactly as it should, the silence of confirmation rather than uncertainty. The day before the hearing, she saddled Thunder Vale for the first time, not to ride him. She was not ready to ride him, and she knew it. And more importantly, she knew he knew it, and the knowing together was part of what had made everything else possible. She tacked him up slowly, every piece of equipment offered for his inspection before it touched him. The saddle blanket first, and then the saddle. And he stood with the same vibrating tension he had shown the first time the blanket went on. The whole body attention of a creature taking something seriously. And then the tension eased, and he dropped his head, and she tightened the cinch gently and stepped back. He stood tacked up in the center of the corral. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Tomorrow," she said, "I have to go to town and do something important. But I wanted you to know that whatever happens in that courtroom, this," she gestured between them, "this doesn't change. This is already done. This already happened." His ears moved forward. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Samuel, at the fence, heard this. He turned away and busied himself with something that required his full attention in the other direction, and she was grateful for that. The morning of the hearing, she dressed in the best thing she owned, which was not very good by town standards and was not intended to impress Charles Bennett, who would be there with his lawyer and his city clothes and his absolute conviction, probably still intact despite everything, that he was a man the world owed something. She dressed to honor the people who had brought their documents and their memories and their courage to Croft's office over the past weeks. She dressed for Martha Emerson and Robert Emerson's memory and the Sullivan family and George Phelps sitting in a chair deciding to tell the truth about himself. She dressed for Pete Garvey and his careful pencil lines in the snow. Samuel drove her in. The courthouse in Red Creek was a single large room on the upper floor of the county building, and by the time they arrived it was already full. She had not expected that. She had expected the principals, herself and Croft and Bennett and his lawyer and the witnesses, and perhaps some of the curious. She had not expected every seat occupied and people standing along the walls and faces she recognized from every part of the county. People who had known her and Daniel and her father before that. People who had watched the auction in October with amusement. People who had stood at their fences waiting for her to fail. They were not laughing now. She walked to the front of the room and sat at the table beside Croft and did not look at Bennett, who was at the opposite table with his lawyer, a man from Cheyenne who wore a very good suit and had the expression of a man who has just received some information about the weight of the evidence against his client and is revising his strategy in real time. Bennett looked at her. She looked back. The thing that she noticed in that moment, across the width of the room, was that something in his expression had changed. Not broken. Men like Bennett did not break easily, and sometimes did not break at all. But the absolute certainty was gone. In its place was something more calculating, more careful. The expression of a man who has been comfortable for so long that discomfort reads on his face as a foreign thing, something he does not know the shape of. Good, she thought. Judge Harlan was a compact, deliberate man of 65, who had been on the bench long enough to have seen most varieties of human misbehavior and had developed, as a result, a finely calibrated sense of when a case was what it presented itself as and when it was something else entirely. He looked at the room. He looked at the two tables. He said, "We will proceed." What followed lasted 4 hours and felt both longer and shorter than that, the way important things do when you are inside them. Croft presented the territorial water rights document. He presented the original deed and survey records from Daniel's tin box. He presented the Emerson letter and the Sullivan documents and the pattern they established across 3 properties and 6 years. He presented Pete Garvey's drawing and Margaret Hollis's testimony about the Pinto horse and the 2 riders in the dark. He presented Samuel Whitaker's statement about what he had seen 15 years ago when he worked for the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium and had left because of it. And he presented George Phelps, who sat in the witness chair and said, in a flat and careful voice, that he had on 4 separate occasions provided confidential account information about property owners to Charles Bennett or his representatives, and that he had done so because Bennett had given him to understand that his continued employment at the bank depended on his cooperation, and that he understood this was wrong and had understood it at the time and had done it anyway, and that he was sorry for it. The room was very quiet during Phelps's testimony. Bennett's lawyer objected several times. Judge Harlan sustained some of the objections and overruled others, and his expression throughout suggested a man working through a complex calculation toward a conclusion he was approaching steadily from one direction. Bennett himself said nothing. His lawyer had clearly advised silence, and Bennett had clearly accepted this advice, which told her that his lawyer understood the weight of what was in front of them, and had decided that Bennett's voice was more dangerous than his absence. When Croft finished, Bennett's lawyer presented his counter-argument. It was competent. The man from Cheyenne was not stupid, and the case he made was the best case that could be made from the available material, which was to say, it was a case that would have been persuasive if the other side had nothing, and was noticeably less persuasive when the other side had what Croft had assembled. Judge Harlan did not retire to consider his ruling. He sat for a moment after the last argument was concluded, looking at the papers before him with the stillness of a man who has already reached his conclusion and is taking the appropriate amount of time before announcing it, so that the announcement carries the weight it deserves. Then he looked up. The title challenge filed by the Red Creek Land and Cattle Consortium against the Parker homestead is dismissed, he said. The original grant, deed of title, and water rights certificate are affirmed as valid and uncontested. He paused. Furthermore, the court finds sufficient evidence of a pattern of fraudulent conduct to warrant a formal investigation into the consortium's activities as they relate to the Emerson, Sullivan, and Bison Creek properties referenced in the proceedings today. Another pause. Mr. Bennett, you are instructed to appear before this court in 30 days to address the specific allegations of fraud, conspiracy, and criminal interference presented today. Failure to appear will result in the immediate issuance of a warrant. The room erupted, not all at once. It started somewhere in the middle and spread outward in both directions, the way things spread in rooms full of people who have been waiting a long time for something to go right. A sound that was not quite cheering and not quite weeping, and was most accurately described as release. The collective exhale of a great many people letting go of something they had been holding for too long. Abigail sat very still in the middle of it. Croft put a hand briefly on the table, not quite touching her hand, the gesture of a man who does not touch people easily, offering what he can. "It's done," he said. She nodded. She did not trust her voice for a moment. Across the room, Bennett was speaking in a low, rapid voice to his lawyer, who was shaking his head slightly, the small, precise headshake of a man delivering information that the person receiving it does not want to receive. Bennett's face was doing things she had not seen it do before. The performance of ease was gone entirely. What was underneath it was complicated and not altogether pleasant, but it was real. And real was something she found she could respect even in an enemy, in a way she had never been able to respect the performance. He looked at her once, from across the room. She looked back at him steadily. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel the hot, bright feeling she might have expected. What she felt was something quieter and more durable. The specific satisfaction of a thing done right, completed properly, built on a foundation solid enough to hold. She felt like the day she had stood in the East Corral with her hand on Thunder Vale's neck for the first time, and he had stood still. Not victory. Something better than that. Arrival. Samuel drove her home from the courthouse in silence. The good kind of silence. The kind that does not need to be filled, because what is inside it is already complete. The road was frozen hard, and the horse's hooves rang against it with a clean sound that carried in the cold air. And Abigail sat on the bench beside him, with her hands in her lap, and watched the mountains come closer as they left town behind. And she felt the day settling into her, the way cold water settles into dry ground. Slowly, fully, reaching places that had been waiting a long time to receive it. She had not cried in the courthouse. She cried now, briefly and without apology, looking straight ahead at the road. And Samuel did not say anything or look at her, just let it be what it was, which was the right thing to do. By the time they reached the gate of the ranch, she was done. She climbed down from the wagon and went directly to the east corral. Thunder Vale was at the far end when she came through the gate, but he turned when he heard her, and then he walked toward her. Not at the gate, toward her, crossing the whole width of the corral, at a steady walk with his ears forward and his head at the level of his shoulder. The body language of a horse that is coming, because he wants to, and for no other reason. She stood in the center of the corral and let him come, and when he reached her, he put his nose against the front of her coat and breathed, a long, slow breath that she felt through the wool. She put both arms around his neck. She stood there for a long time. "We're all right," she said into the warmth of his mane. "We're going to be all right." His weight shifted slightly toward her, the almost imperceptible lean of a very large animal, deciding that where it is standing is exactly where it wants to be, and she felt that shift the way you feel the particular moments that matter, not with drama, but with the quiet recognition of something true arriving in its own time. The following morning she rode him for the first time. She had thought it would take longer. She had been prepared for longer, had told herself that the timeline was his, and she would follow it wherever it led, and that the riding was not the point anyway. The trust was the point. The riding was just what trust looked like when it was complete enough to carry weight. But when she came to the corral that morning with the saddle, something in the way he stood as she tacked him up told her this was the day. She could not have explained it to anyone who hadn't spent 8 weeks learning to read him. He was still. Not the wired stillness of the early weeks, not the coiled tension of an animal holding itself together by main force. He was still the way a person is still when they are ready for something. She put her foot in the stirrup. She paused. He did not move. She swung up. He stood. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the moment stretched out long and particular, the way first moments of the right kind always do. And then she asked him forward with the lightest pressure of her leg, and he walked, smooth and deliberate, and entirely present, around the perimeter of the corral, and she sat on his back with her hands soft on the reins, and felt what she had not allowed herself to feel before, because allowing yourself to feel something, before it is real, is a kind of theft from yourself. She felt joy, uncomplicated and full, the joy of something that seemed impossible turning out to be not only possible, but already done. Samuel was at the gate. She did not look at him, because she was afraid that if she looked at him while she felt this much, she would cry again, and she had cried enough for 1 week. But she heard him say, very quietly, "Well, I'll be damned." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed, genuinely, fully, with her whole chest, since February. Thunder Vale's ears flicked back at the sound, and then forward again, and his stride did not change. News of the courthouse ruling moved through Red Creek with the same speed as everything else that mattered, which was to say, it was everywhere by the following morning. The specifics spread in layers. First, the ruling itself, then the details of what Croft had presented, then the revelation about George Phelps and the bank, then the question of what it meant for the other properties Bennett had acquired. People who had been waiting to see which way things fell were now deciding what they thought, and the deciding was audible in every public space in town. Charles Bennett did not appear in public for 4 days. When he did, something had changed about him that people noticed and discussed and could not quite name. Not a physical change, not anything as obvious as that, but a subtraction of something that had always been present, the quality of absolute certainty, the bearing of a man who has never had to consider that he might be wrong. It was gone. What was in its place was something smaller and more careful, the posture of a man who has discovered that the world he believed was built to his specifications was in fact built to specifications he had never seen. Tolliver was not with him. Nobody seemed to know where Tolliver had gone. Nobody asked about it too loudly. Abigail drove into town on Thursday to see Croft and to stop at the bank, where she made the full payment on her note with the money she had assembled, and the $20 from her sister and the price of Daniel's watch, and where the teller, a young man who had been pointedly neutral throughout the previous months, was now pointedly cordial in a way she found almost funny. The social flexibility of people renegotiating their positions in real time. At Croft's office, he told her that Bennett's lawyer had been in contact about a possible settlement regarding the Emerson and Sullivan properties. "What kind of settlement?" she said. "Restitution," Croft said. "Compensation for the properties acquired under fraudulent circumstances. Not the land itself, that has changed hands and built things since. It is not simple to unwind. But financial restitution at current assessed values." He paused. "It is, I suspect, his attempt to resolve the criminal exposure as a civil matter." "Can he do that?" "He can offer it," Croft said. "The Emersons and Sullivans would have to accept, and the territorial prosecutor, who is now involved, has his own position on whether criminal charges proceed, regardless of civil settlement." She thought about Martha Emerson and the flour sack of documents she had carried for 3 years. About Robert Emerson, who had died holding the weight of a loss that didn't have to happen. "What do you think the Emersons will want?" she said. Croft was quiet for a moment. "I think Martha Emerson wants 2 things," he said. "Money, because she needs it, and for Charles Bennett to stand in a room and be held responsible for what he did, in front of people who know him, in a way that cannot be called anything other than what it is." He paused. "A financial settlement gives her one of those things." "And the other?" "That," Croft said, "will depend on the prosecutor." She left his office thinking about what accountability looked like when it was real. Not the performance of it, not the social theater of a man being politely corrected, but the actual structural consequence of someone being made to account, publicly and on record, for the specific harm they had done to specific people who deserved better. She thought Daniel would have appreciated it. He had been a man who believed in the weight of documented fact, in the power of a thing being written down in the right place at the right time. He had spent the last year of his life doing exactly that, quietly, without telling her, building a case for a fight he had hoped she would never need to have. She stopped at the general store on the way out of town. Marcus Henley was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in and said, "Mrs. Parker," and then added, "Congratulations," in the slightly awkward way of a man who is not sure he has the right to say it, but feels it needs saying. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "I want you to know," he said, and then stopped and started again. "I want you to know that I should have said something sooner. About Bennett. There were things I knew, things I saw. I didn't say anything because I didn't think it would make a difference." He met her eyes briefly. "I was wrong about that." She looked at him. He was a decent man. Most of the people in Red Creek were decent people who had done the thing that decent people most commonly do, which was to make themselves comfortable with not acting because action seemed costly and the outcome uncertain. She had done it herself, in other situations. She understood it. "You could still say something," she said, "to Croft. Whatever you know. It might still matter." He nodded. "I'm going to," he said. "I decided that yesterday." She bought her salt and coffee and left. January came. With it came 3 things of significance. The first was the formal indictment of Charles Bennett on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and criminal interference with property rights, issued by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office on the 14th of the month, and served at Bennett's house by the county sheriff in the presence of 2 witnesses. The second was a settlement agreement between Bennett and the Emerson family, the terms of which Croft described to Abigail as fair, and which Martha Emerson described to Abigail directly, on a cold afternoon in the ranch kitchen over coffee, as more than she had expected, and not as much as she deserved, which was probably the most accurate description of most justice. The third thing was that Abigail Parker rode Thunder Vale off her property for the first time. She did not plan it. She did not decide, on a particular morning, that today was the day they would go beyond the corral, beyond the paddock, beyond the fence line she had not crossed with him since the auction. It happened the way the real progressions between them had always happened. Not through decision, but through readiness arriving and being recognized. She was riding him along the south fence line in the thin January sun, the ground frozen solid under his hooves, the air cold enough to make his breath and hers come in white plumes with every stride, and she reached the south gate, and the gate was open. Samuel had left it open, she saw later, which she suspected was not accidental, Samuel having his own precise understanding of timing. And she felt him notice the open gate, and felt him make the question with his body, the slight slowing, the attention shifting forward, and she said very quietly, "All right." He walked through this gate. He walked through the gate and out onto the road that ran south toward Red Creek, and he walked along it for 20 yards, and then she turned him, and he went, willingly, back through the gate and into the paddock, and she got down and stood next to him, and her hand was shaking slightly when she put it on his neck, though she could not have said precisely why. "Good," she said, to herself as much as to him. "Good." Pete Garvey saw it from the road. He was on his way home from school, taking his usual cut across the corner of her property, and he stopped and watched them come through the gate and turn and go back in, and he stood there for a moment afterward looking at the gate, and then he continued home. That evening he told his father, and his father told Henry Walsh at the saddle shop the following morning. Henry Walsh told his wife that night. "She rode that horse off the property today," he said. His wife looked at him over her mending. "Of course she did," she said. By February, Abigail was riding Thunder Vale along the road to town. Not all the way to town, not yet, but part way. Down the south road to the creek crossing and back, then a little farther, adding distance the way she added everything with him, incrementally and with attention to what he was telling her. I was telling her, increasingly, that he was ready for more, that the world beyond the fence line was something he was prepared to examine at length and with interest, that the particular quality of alert attention he brought to new things was curiosity rather than fear, had perhaps always been curiosity underneath the fear, the curiosity of an intelligent creature that had been prevented by circumstance from exercising its intelligence safely. She watched him notice things and process them and decide, repeatedly, that they were manageable. She understood this process from the inside. Samuel remarked, one morning in February, that Thunder Vale's shoulder musculature had changed. "He's carrying himself differently," Samuel said. "Look at the base of his neck. That's a horse that stopped bracing for a blow." She looked. Samuel was right. The change was visible when you knew what to look for. The difference between a body that is always prepared for impact and a body that has learned, over time and through repeated evidence, that impact is not the inevitable outcome of every moment. The tension was still there, in the way that a thing that was once true leaves a shape behind even when it is no longer true, but it was no longer the dominant note. Something else was dominant now. She was still looking at it when the wagon came up the road. Not Bennett's buggy. A ranch wagon, working class, with a woman on the bench and a man beside her and 2 children in the back. She recognized them when the wagon was closer, the Sullivans, from Bison Creek, a family she had met once at the courthouse and not before. The man climbed down first and then helped his wife down, and they stood at her gate with the uncertain posture of people who have come a long distance to say something and are not entirely sure how to begin. She went to the gate. "Mr. Sullivan," she said. "Mrs. Sullivan, come in." They came in. They sat at her kitchen table. She made coffee. Tom Sullivan was 40 years old, brown-haired, with the careful hands of a man who had built things and lost things and was in the process of figuring out what to build next. His wife, Clara, was quieter, watchful, the kind of woman who makes assessments before she speaks, and whose assessments tend to be accurate. "We came to say thank you," Tom Sullivan said. "We know the case wasn't brought on our account, but what happened in that courtroom?" He paused, working for the right words. "It changed things. Not just the settlement. It changed." He looked at his wife. "It changed what's possible," Clara Sullivan said. Abigail looked at her. "We lost that land 2 years ago," Clara said. "And we spent those 2 years believing there was no recourse. believing that men like Bennett were simply how the world was built, and that the only thing to do about it was find a way around them. She paused. Watching what you did, what Croft did, what Samuel Whitaker did, what Martha Emerson did, it changed what we thought was possible, not just for ourselves. She paused again. For our children. The two children in question were visible through the kitchen window, in the paddock with Thunder Vale. She had not invited them there. Apparently Thunder Vale had not objected, because the children were standing at the fence, and the horse was at the fence, and the interaction appeared to be proceeding with the calm interest of all parties. She watched this for a moment. He doesn't let most people close, she said. Clara Sullivan looked out the window. He seems all right with them. He is, Abigail said, and she thought, of course he is. Of course he is, because children approach things without the accumulated fear and agenda that adults bring, without the need to control or the expectation of resistance, just with open attention, and open attention was the thing Thunder Vale had always responded to, from the very first day at the auction fence, when she had stood and looked and seen something that everyone else had already decided not to see. The Sullivans stayed for an hour. When they left, Clara Sullivan stopped at the door and turned. There's a family over near Laramie, she said. The Harpers. Lost their place last year. Bad situation. Not the same as ours. Different circumstances. But bad. The wife is managing alone. 3 children. She paused. I told her about you. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Send her to Croft first, she said. He'll know what's possible. Clara Sullivan nodded. She went out. Abigail stood in the kitchen for a moment after the wagon had pulled away, looking at the table. Daniel's ledger, the tin box in its place on the shelf now, rather than the desk drawer, the letter from her sister in Denver that had arrived last week with congratulations, and the observation that Abigail had always been the stubbornest of the 3 girls, and that this quality had finally produced an unambiguously positive outcome. She thought about the Harper family near Laramie, about the fact that Clara Sullivan had told them about her, about what it meant for one person's refusal to fold to become, through the simple mechanism of other people watching and deciding what was possible, something that reached people they had never met and places they had never been. She had not done any of it for that purpose. She had done it because the land was hers, and the horse was misunderstood, and Charles Bennett was wrong, and she was stubborn enough and angry enough and, underneath both of those things, clear-eyed enough to see that what was being taken from her was worth fighting for. But it had become something else in the doing of it. The way things sometimes do when enough people are watching, and what they see is not a performance of courage, but actual courage, which looks different, which is quieter and less clean, and involves a great deal of sitting at kitchen tables alone at night, doing arithmetic and writing letters, and refusing to answer a man's offer, no matter how many times it is delivered. In March, the Red Creek Spring Exhibition announced its annual competition. The exhibition had been held every spring for 12 years, a county-wide event that combined livestock showing with ranch skills demonstrations and had, over time, become the social event of the year for the ranching community. Abigail had attended every year since her marriage. She and Daniel had shown cattle twice, placing in the middle of the field both times, which Daniel had considered respectable, and Abigail had considered insufficient, and which had produced one of their most entertaining arguments. She had not planned to enter this year. The idea came from Samuel, which she should have anticipated, because Samuel's best ideas always arrived sideways, as if he was not quite making a suggestion, but merely observing a possibility that happened to be shaped like a suggestion. The exhibition has an open halter class, he said, one morning in March, for any horse. No breed requirement. No previous competition requirement. She was working with Thunder Vale's feet at the time, which was the most recent frontier, convincing him to stand still and balanced while she lifted each hoof in turn, checking and cleaning, the kind of ordinary horsekeeping that he had apparently never experienced without it becoming a confrontation. He was standing still now. He had stood still for 3 weeks. The lifting of each foot produced a slight tension that eased within seconds as he remembered, each time, that the outcome of this specific situation was not harm. She looked up at Samuel from where she was crouched by Thunder Vale's near foreleg. "You think we're ready for that," she said. "I think the question of whether you're ready isn't the interesting one," Samuel said. She thought about it. "When is the exhibition?" she said. "Third week of April," Samuel said. She stood up and looked at Thunder Vale, who turned his head and regarded her with the direct, undefended attention that still, 5 months in, could catch her off guard. The quality of his attention, the way it was given fully and without reserve, the way it assumed good faith and consistently found it confirmed. "All right," she said. The weeks between March and the third week of April were the fullest she had lived since before Daniel died. Not the frantic fullness of crisis, the bank letters, and the fire, and the courthouse, and the months of fighting. Bennett's pressure on every front, but the fullness of actual work, of something being built, of days with a direction and an endpoint that was worth reaching. She rode Thunder Vale every day. They went farther each time, past the creek crossing, up the south road to the edge of town and back, once all the way into Red Creek on a Tuesday morning when the street was quiet, and people on the boardwalk stopped and looked as she rode past, and she nodded to the ones she knew and rode on, and Thunder Vale's ears moved at the sounds and the smells and the particular commotion of a town going about its Tuesday business. And he processed each new thing and decided, one by one, that it was manageable. He did not spook. He did not bolt. He did not become anyone he wasn't. Henry Walsh watched them ride past the saddle shop, and that evening told his wife, for the second time, about Thunder Vale. And this time, his wife put down her mending and looked at him and said, "I want to come to the exhibition." The third week of April arrived clear and cold in the morning and warming toward noon, the kind of spring day that Wyoming occasionally produces, as if by way of apology for the winter it has just imposed. The exhibition grounds were full by 8 in the morning. Not just the ranching families, townspeople, children released from school for the occasion, people who had driven in from as far as 30 miles because word had traveled the way. Word travels about things that people have decided matter. And what word had traveled in this case was not just about a horse, but about the woman who had bought it for $1, and what had happened since. Abigail arrived with Samuel driving the wagon and Thunder Vale on a lead behind it. She had not put him in a trailer. She had decided weeks ago that she would not ask him to do that. Not this year, perhaps not ever, because there was no reason to force him into an enclosed moving space when he could travel perfectly well alongside a wagon on a lead. And the decision about what to ask of him and what not to was, she felt, as much her decision as his. He walked into the exhibition grounds on the lead without breaking stride. She heard the noise change. It was not silence this time. It was not the dead flat silence of the auction yard in October, the silence of contempt. It was the sound of a crowd that has seen something it didn't expect and is renegotiating, rapidly, what it thinks about the situation. She walked Thunder Vale to the registration table and gave her name and the horse's name. The man at the table looked up. He knew who she was. Everyone knew who she was. "Thunder Vale," he said, writing it down. "The horse from the auction in October." "The same," she said. He wrote it down without further comment. The open halter class was held in the main arena at noon. There were 11 horses entered, 7 of them trained show horses with careful grooming and experienced handlers who knew the patterns of the class, how to move the horse, how to present it, the precise choreography of competition. Abigail had not coached herself in those patterns. She had coached herself to walk alongside Thunder Vale, the way she walked alongside him every day, at his pace, in the particular partnership of two creatures who have learned each other's language through patience and attention, and the repeated daily choice to show up. She walked him into the arena. The crowd noise changed again. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Thunder Vale, who was looking at the arena, at the bleachers, at the fence line, and the flags, and the particular concentrated presence of several hundred human beings in one space, and she watched him process it the way she had watched him process every new thing, with the full-bodied attention of a creature that takes the world seriously and refuses to be dishonest about what it is feeling. His ears were forward, not flat, not back. Forward, both of them, pointed at the arena and the crowd and the morning light and the flags. She put her hand briefly on his neck, and he shifted his weight slightly toward her, just slightly, the private communication of two beings in a public space, reminding each other that they are not alone in it. They walked the pattern. She would not, afterward, be able to describe it with precision. The specific sequence of gaits, the turns, the halt, the presentation to the judge. What she would remember was the quality of it, which was unlike anything she had felt before on a horse, a sensation of complete mutuality, of two beings doing something together in the fullest sense of the word together, not one directing and one complying, but both deciding, moment by moment, to be exactly where they were. The arena was very quiet. She became aware of the quiet gradually, the way you become aware of something when it changes. The crowd noise had not disappeared, but had dropped, pulled down by the collective attention of a large group of people watching something that required them to be still. The judge called the halt. She stopped. Thunderveil stopped. He stood square and calm and utterly present in the center of the arena, his head at the level of his shoulder, his coat catching the noon light, his breath steady. She heard someone in the bleachers say something she couldn't make out, and someone else answer, and a third person say, very clearly in the quiet, "That's the horse from the auction." The judge walked toward them. How was an older man, a horseman of considerable reputation, who had been judging the Red Creek exhibition for 8 years, and he stopped in front of Thunderveil and looked at him for a long time with the careful assessment of someone who knows exactly what they are looking at and is taking the measure of it properly. Then he looked at Abigail. "How long have you been working with this horse?" he said. "Since October," she said. He looked at Thunderveil again. "He was considered unworkable," he said. "He was considered a great many things," she said. "Most of them were wrong." The judge's expression shifted. A movement in the lines around his eyes that was not quite a smile, but contained the same content, the recognition of something that deserves recognition. He stepped back. Thunderveil took first place in the open halter class. The sound that came from the bleachers when the ribbon was announced was different from anything Abigail had heard in the courthouse or the auction yard or anywhere else in the previous 6 months. It was not the sound of judgment reversing itself. It was not the sound of a crowd that has been proven wrong and is adjusting. It was the sound of people who have watched something true and are glad they saw it. She stood in the arena with the blue ribbon in her hand and Thunderveil beside her, and she thought about October, about the silver dollar warm in her coat pocket, about the way he had looked at her across the fence at the auction, with his eyes moving and his sides heaving, and the whole weight of everything that had been done to him visible in the way he held himself, braced and ready and utterly exhausted by the bracing. She thought about Daniel's tin box and Martha Emerson's flour sack, and Samuel standing at the north fence saying "It's my fight now," and Pete Garvey crouched in the snow with his pencil and his school handwriting and his thorough attention to what was actually in front of him. She thought about all the people in all the rooms who had decided, one at a time, that what was possible was different from what they had believed, and who had let that decision cost them something, and who had done it anyway. Samuel was at the arena gate when she walked Thunderveil out. He took one look at the ribbon, and then one long look at the horse, and then he looked at her, and he said nothing, which was the right thing, which was always, with Samuel, the right thing. Behind him, Martha Emerson was standing with Tom and Clara Sullivan and Pete Garvey, and his father and Marcus Henley from the general store, and Henry Walsh from the saddle shop and his wife with her mending hands folded together in front of her, and Tom Aldridge from the town council, who had the particular expression of a man redeeming a small debt, and half a dozen other people whose names she knew and whose faces she knew and whose presence in this specific spot at this specific moment told her something about what had happened in Red Creek since October that she had not fully understood until right now. They had not just watched. They had been waiting to be on the right side of something. She stopped in front of them. She could not think of anything adequate to say. Martha Emerson solved this problem by stepping forward and taking her hand in both of hers and holding it there. And that was enough. That was exactly enough. That was the whole vocabulary of what needed to be communicated between two women who had each lost something and had each refused to stay lost. That evening, she sat on the fence of the East Corral in the last of the April light and watched Thunderveil move in the paddock, unhurried and self-possessed, the horse he had always been underneath the horse that pain had made him, The horse that only needed someone willing to look past the damage to the creature it had not yet been allowed to become. She thought about the Harper family near Laramie, about the things that Croft was still building, the cases that were still open, the people who were still afraid, and who might stop being afraid if someone showed them it was possible. She thought about the tin box on the shelf, about Daniel's handwriting on the ledger cover, about the hat still on the peg by the door that she had decided, somewhere in the past month, to leave there, not because she couldn't move it, but because it was Daniel's way of being in the room, and the room was better for it. She thought about the dollar. $1 silver, warm from her coat pocket, placed on an auctioneer's table in October, while an entire yard full of people laughed at the audacity of spending your last dollar on something everyone had already given up on. The audacity. She had not thought of it as audacity at the time. She had thought of it as the only thing that made sense. She had looked at Thunder Vale and seen something real, something true, something that the cruelty and impatience of other people had buried under layers of fear and defense, and she had thought, that is worth $1. That is worth whatever it costs. And she had been right, not because it had been easy, not because it had gone cleanly or quickly or without cost, not because the world had recognized what she saw and made room for it without a fight, but because the thing she had seen was real, because the creature she had believed in had turned out to be exactly what she had believed him to be, because the land her husband had documented and protected was exactly worth protecting, because the people who had been harmed had deserved someone to stand up and say so in a room where it counted. Because the most important things are almost always the things that someone, somewhere, has already decided aren't worth the trouble. Thunder Vale came to the fence. He put his head over the rail, and she put her hand on the flat of his nose, warm and solid under her palm. And they stayed like that in the April evening, while the light went off the mountains, and the first stars came up, and the ranch settled into its night sounds. The sounds she knew by heart. The sounds of a place that was hers, that had always been hers, that would remain hers, that she had earned and kept, and would go on earning every day with the same plain stubborn insistence on the value of things that other people had written off. Some people are worth believing in before they have given you a single reason to believe. Some things are worth fighting for before you know whether you can win. And sometimes the greatest act of courage a person can perform is simply to look at something the whole world has given up on and refuse, quietly, stubbornly, with full knowledge of the cost, to give up too. Abigail Parker had walked into an auction yard with $1 silver and walked out with the thing nobody else could see, and in doing so, she had given an entire town permission to see it too.